Chapter 1234. In fact, he didn't want to participate in the battle between Yufeng and Ghost Chariot, but the strange creatures in the Rosaline wilderness were eyeing his life. Those people seemed to have realized this as well. If he didn't agree, wouldn't the Rosaline family have to wait for death on the other side of the Taiga Strait? Back at the Swift Plains. That was the hard work of the Rosaline family for many years. The fat on his face couldn't help but tremble. He knew that he wasn't someone who could achieve great things, and he wasn't even as wise as his father. Sometimes it was like holding a knife to a person's neck, and he had no choice but to make such a choice. Forget it, I'll take one step at a time. After the helpless anger in his heart, the Rosaline overlord was a little disheartened. He raised his head and saw a familiar face. Isn't this the young man just now? He was stunned for a moment, then screamed as if he had seen a ghost. He was so frightened that he fell from the horse's back and fainted on the spot. The overlord's knight instantly became agitated. They hurriedly yelled and pulled this ridiculously fat guy up from the ground. Brando stood in front of these people and looked at this chaotic scene speechlessly. He thought to himself, am I that scary? He shook his head and turned around. Bobin, who was holding his bloody right arm, stood beside him and looked at him helplessly. His overlord was, after all, an ordinary person. After all, the Rosaline family had been content with their territory for such a long time. It was understandable that he hadn't seen a person of this level. Mr. Bobin. Brando ignored the noisy knight and asked calmly, is what you said true? The guard captain revealed a bitter smile. Young master, you probably don't understand the prestige Lord Darius had in the Allied forces in that era. You said that you had once caused a commotion in the Empire. In fact, if you had taken the official route, there would definitely be many people in the Empire who would be willing to help you behind your back. Lord Deputy Marshal, don't call me that. It makes me uncomfortable. The middle-aged man smiled. I'm no longer the Deputy Marshal of the Allied forces. Besides, I'm not from the Empire. After I gave the title of Grand Duke to my eldest son, I no longer have anything to do with the Empire and the Holy Cathedral of Fire. I'm just a follower of Lord Darius. As his successor, you deserve to be addressed as such. Moreover, your strength is worthy of my recognition. Brando smiled bitterly. He never dreamed that this man would have such an identity. If the other party had not called out his identity at the last moment, he would have killed him with his sword. What he did not expect was that he would be able to fight against the Deputy Marshal of the Holy Cathedral of Fire's Allied forces in Rosaline, which was tens of thousands of miles away from Wonde. In the Holy War half a century ago, the Allied forces of the Holy Cathedral of Fire only had one commander, and that was Darius, his grandfather. Other than him, the person with the highest status in the Allied forces should be the Silver Princess Constance, who was Darius's right-hand woman. However, the Allied forces were made up of dozens of large and small duchies and kingdoms, including the connections between the different armies. Of course, it was impossible for these two people to support the entire command system. For the armies of this era, the Holy Cathedral of Fire also used a relatively backward system to ensure that there were no problems with the overall command and communication between the troops. That was to select a member of the royal family, or a member of the most powerful family in a kingdom or dukedom who was outstanding in strength and prestige to serve as the secondary commander of these troops. Although this command system was backward and inefficient, it was surprisingly effective in ensuring communication between the armies. After all, under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, most of the nobles in the kingdoms had a harmonious relationship with each other, and most of them had private dealings with each other. Coupled with their own prestige in their own countries, they were able to suppress the voices and dissatisfaction of the army sent out by their own countries. In this way, even though the command system was chaotic and complicated, Saint-Tossel and Fanzin were not much better in comparison. In a situation where everyone's movements were slow, they could just sit down and fight their own battles. After all, the nobles did not care how many people died. However, among these nominal commanders, not all of them were just nominal commanders. In fact, in the vast land under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, there had always been geniuses and strong people, regardless of the era. Outside of the Cruz Empire, there were also people who shone like new stars. His grandfather Darius was not an exception. Even within the Erewhon Empire there was also Tulman, an anomaly. The kingdom of Erewhon had never been special in Wonde. Although it was the most dazzling jewel on the crown of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, under the rule of the Cruz Empire, there were also many duchies and kingdoms of various sizes. These duchies and kingdoms were all outstanding people, including the members of the royal family and the Grand Duke, and a total of more than 10 deputy marshals were chosen. And Boban was one of them. In fact, Brando was not unfamiliar with his original identity and name. Boban was actually the grandfather of the nun Princess Magadal, the father of the current Grand Duke of the Antiburo Duchy, the previous Grand Duke, and one of the most famous deputy marshals of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. White Wolf Blademaster 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 Blademaster, the third strongest person in the Cruz Alliance. After hearing the other party's identity, Brendel couldn't help but break out in cold sweat. Fortunately, the other party left Vaunt disheartened because his grandfather was convicted for no reason, coupled with the fact that his strength had decreased due to his injuries in the Holy War. If the other party was still at his peak, Brendel might not be able to win against him. His current strength was much higher than the peak of the Supreme Realm, but on the basis of his understanding of the law of the Sage Domain, if it was just based on swordsmanship, Blademaster's flash strike sword art might have really made him suffer. Obviously, this old sword saint also saw this point. First, he used the Mirror of Still Water to deceive Brendel into subconsciously withdrawing his law, and then used the flash strike sword art to force Brendel to only use his swordsmanship. If not for his strong foundation and the fact that Blademaster's strength was not at his peak, the outcome of the battle would have been hard to predict. Fortunately, everything had been decided. Thinking of this, Brando suddenly vaguely felt something. He followed the gaze that fell on his face and saw the little girl named Huang Hua staring at him. Her black eyes were full of admiration. He was slightly stunned, as if he saw the battle between him and Blademaster from her eyes. It was a shocking battle between two swordsmanships. Perhaps it was a scene that could only be seen 1,000 years ago, but at this moment, it was repeated in this land so far away from Wonde. When Boban's flash strike sword art was unsheathed, there was only a moment left for him to react. His choice was to retreat. But it was not just retreat. He took a step back but left a phantom in place. The phantom's face was blurry, but its figure was exactly the same as him. Its 5 fingers were slightly open, and a long sword with golden flames flowing like a blazing flame appeared in its hand. It pulled the sword and drew a circle in the air. With a clang it collided with Boban's sword. This was the second sword. Brando seemed to be unable to resist and began to retreat. When Huang Hua saw this scene, she could not help but blurt out, but she immediately blushed and covered her mouth, realizing that she had lost her composure. The rigid education of the 9 Phoenix royal family made Huang Hua ashamed of her rudeness. This was not how a descendant of the Jade Phoenix should behave. It was just that this sword was too wonderful. She was not talking about Brando's sword, but Boban's sword. Boban's flash strike sword art was like a raging wave, as if he had found a way to break through Brando's retreat. His sword was flat and vertical, simple and direct, but he did not give his opponent any chance to breathe. That was the fire of vengeance that burned out, unreasonably wild. But Huang Hua frowned at Brando's sword. She could not reach the peak of swordsmanship, but this did not mean that her understanding of swordsmanship was low. On the contrary, her knowledge and talent had long made her understand this battle better than most people present. Even Insursta and Tarkus were present. To be honest, Huang Hua was a little disappointed with Brando's swordsmanship. Although it was average and barely blocked Boban's amazing swordsmanship, but that was it. If she continued to think like this, she could see that Brando would definitely not win. She clenched the sword in her hand, silently preparing to attack. Although such a battle was not something she could intervene in, the path of the Jade Phoenix did not abandon her allies and run away. But it was at this moment. A dazzling verdant brilliance came into her eyes. It was Brando's second sword. This sword move had conquered everyone present. On the Azure Sword, the Azure Sea, the Azure Sky, the dream of Faya and Malurcha, and Miss Tada's lifelong wish were reflected. The Azure Sky was like a dream, the sea and the sky were a line. The phantom holding the Frostchant Cinna and the phantom holding the Flaming Blade, one on the left and one on the right, attacked Boban. The 2 sacred swords of completely opposite attributes intertwined with fire and ice, one blue and one red, like two jumping parallel lines. They appeared in front of everyone's eyes. The two swords intertwined, and it was as beautiful as an illusion. Bobin's expression changed. Very few people knew that there was once a swordsmanship in this world that was on par with the flash strike sword art. Its name and its creator had all disappeared from this world. Saint Tossel, 9 luminaries sword art. And at this moment Brando also smiled, because he found that he had found a way to use these 7 sacred swords. Lord Wind Empress, thank you. P.S. Ambush may need to be written until 13, and continue to ask for monthly vote. Chapter 1235. Brando didn't use his sword again. After blocking Bobin's sword with flaming edge, he used Frost Chant Cinna's Phantom to quickly counter with Cruz's short sword technique. He was very familiar with the swordsmanship passed down by Cruz and Erwin. Although these swordsmanship couldn't be said to be amazing, after the precipitation of history, they became more concise and clear. They were truly practical swordsmanship. With his understanding of swordsmanship and the 9 luminary sword technique as a footnote, it was enough to turn something rotten into something magical. After 7 consecutive strikes, Bobin had no choice but to give up on using flash strike sword technique, because there was still flaming edge eyeing him. At this time Bobin's heart sank as he understood that he had lost his last chance. Clang 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 clang. After 7 consecutive strikes, the 2 swords would cross 7 or 8 steps in the direction that Bobin had retreated. By the 7th strike there was a complete difference between offense and defense. At this time Phoenix Fire could no longer see the exquisiteness of the swordsmanship. She only felt that Mr. Brando's swordsmanship was just right. As it was indeed just right. Bobin's heart was filled with joy. Looking at Brando's sword, his eyes shone with a strange light. Of course, he could recognize that this was the fast sword technique of the Anzaruta region. It was one of the swordsmanship that the locals used in duels. Only people who were familiar with these 2 countries, and only people who truly understood swordsmanship, could display this plain and simple swordsmanship to such a level. It wasn't as grand as flash strike sword technique or 9 luminary sword technique, but it was just right to be used here. There was no need to use anything more magnificent. Swordsmanship was the art of battle. A real battle didn't have any extra burdens. He had retreated to the limit, and the Phantom's fast sword technique had also reached the limit. This was the limit of human strength, but there were still some things in this world that couldn't be guessed by human strength, and that was the 9 luminary sword technique. A miracle witnessed by the moon of magic. A swordsmanship that used magic as its basis. When Bobin finished the last step of the fast sword technique, he saw a bright golden line flash in the darkness. It was a long and narrow sword blade. It was so bright that it seemed to be brighter than his entire life. His mind was intoxicated, as if he had seen all the truths of the world. If it wasn't for the resolute will of an old soldier that made him wake up at the last moment and shout out that name, he would have died. This sword not only drew a trail of blood on his shoulder, but also pierced through his neck, because it was flash strike sword art. It fanatically pursued offensive swordsmanship. Its blade was like a raging inferno, shouting to break free from all the shackles of this world, to pursue blood and victory. After a long while, Brando opened his eyes again. The eyeballs wrapped under his eyelids trembled slightly, as if he had just recovered from the dream of the previous battle. His eyes met Huang Hua's. The little girl bowed to him respectfully, not because of the complicated etiquette of the 9 Phoenix imperial family, but because of the respect of a senior. He looked at Huang Hua's dark hair and realized that not everyone in this world was lucky enough to witness an extreme sword. Huang Hua could be considered lucky, as this battle would bring her many things. However, her luck did not lie in the fact that she had witnessed 2 Lemeters fight without holding back. Instead, it lay in the fact that she had enough talent to understand all of this, even though it might take some time. However, to the knight, the guards, and Lord Rosaline who had also witnessed this battle was indeed exciting, but other than that, it was meaningless. This was undoubtedly a pity. These people might never understand what they had missed out on in their entire lives. He was also lucky. When he saw Huang Hua's eyes just now and recalled the battle, he realized that there was something more in his heart. Some things on the path of swordsmanship seemed to have suddenly faded to him. The desire for victory and defeat was no longer something that he had originally calculated in his heart. It had become a pure pursuit and desire. Brando suddenly realized that his fighting talent had begun to evolve from acquired to innate, into something more pure and intuitive. That kind of thing was not to calculate the gains and losses of each strike, but to know that he wanted to win and how to win. It could not be quantified, nor could it be described with words, but it was an understanding in his heart. If he were to rehearse the previous battle again at this moment, when Bobin used the mirror of still water to suppress him, his first choice might be to strike directly with his sword, instead of cautiously putting away his lines of law first. The former was intuition, the latter was experience. He relied on his own experience, which was the most valuable asset to him, whether it was his understanding of swordsmanship, his understanding of combat, his understanding of the past history, and his understanding of everything in the Amber Sword game. They had been his greatest reliance and also his pride in the world. He was once afraid that if he lost all of this, or if all of this no longer worked, what would he do? Now he had the answer. When Brando opened his eyes, it was as if he saw a smooth path in front of him. The inspiration he gained from the battle with Bobin was almost second only to the gains he gained from the battle with his grandfather in the dream. The former gave him the answer to Brando's life, and the latter gave Brando the answer to his future. Only victory, but he was not too surprised in his heart. He was even pleasantly surprised, because he knew that his battle with the deputy marshal was not the result of all of this. It should be said that it was just a trigger. Ever since he had left the elemental barrier, or rather, ever since he had battled the Silver Queen and the many Lemeters of the Empire, the constant battles and the constant increase in his knowledge had finally allowed him to surpass his past self. Perhaps his strength was still not enough, but he understood that it was just an illusion formed by the power of the slate. One day when he had a perfect body again, he would get more than that power. When he understood this point, he suddenly felt the holy sword Odorfice in his hand tremble slightly, as if it was responding to the feelings in his heart. Then, under his astonished gaze, he felt golden lines that spread like flames appear in his mind, and then lines of words appeared on them. Brando suddenly understood. That was the flash strike sword technique, the complete inheritance of the Flame King Gretel. It was displayed in front of his eyes. Insursta and Tarkus stood silently on the messy street. After the Lord of Rosaline was unconscious, the noisy scene did not affect these two spirits at all. After witnessing the battle between Bobin and Brando, the knight would not continue to attack the latter even if they used their knees instead of their brains to think. Thus, even though the street was noisy, the chaos mainly revolved around the Lord of Rosaline. Brando was followed by the captain of the guards, and under the watchful eyes of the two, the others behaved in an orderly manner. The guy who had cursed out loud earlier had already run off to some unknown place. It seemed that he wanted to shed the skin of a knight, and would never dare to return to this place again. Insursta felt that the Earl of Tonagel might not be so petty as to argue with such a guy, but he also understood his thoughts. After all, there were not many people in this world who dared to gamble with their lives. But among these people who could be called desperados, he felt that he should be considered one of the best. Not only did he dare to joke about his existence, to the spirits life was meaningless, only existence had value. He even dared to joke about the head of the supreme ruler of the empire. If he failed, he would not be the only one to lose his head. His close friend Tarku's family would be uprooted, and even the kingdom in the darkness that he thought highly of might not be able to recover from this setback. But there were always lunatics in this world. He was one, Tarkus was one, and he believed that Her Majesty was the same. He could see the insanity in the depths of her beautiful eyes. She did not come to this world with the Mercury staff to save Madara, but to satisfy the uncontrollable desire to rule over everything in her heart. He believed that the Mercury staff's favor towards him originated from the same madness. Because we are dull and monotonous existences and we know it very well. Although we try our best to avoid seeing it clearly, sometimes we have to admit that time and life have lost their meaning to us. Apart from a few fellows in Woolman who treat the hundreds of years of boring experiments as fun, most of us are crazy and prone to self-destruction, Lucien said. He was a little surprised by Lucien's words. Lucien nodded. It's just that this kind of destruction is rather special, obscure and difficult to be discovered by others. We wage war not to fight for survival resources, but simply to prove the existence of the empire. Because existence is too heavy for us. Insursta muttered to himself, repeating the words spoken by the great Lich Ocaso a few hundred years ago. He turned to look at his partner and asked, "What's the matter?" "I'm thinking when the two of us made this plan, did we also have such subconscious thoughts in our hearts?" Tarkus shook his head. He was a serious person, and life was as strict and regular as a wind-up clock to him. There was no meaningful or meaningless dispute. According to the age of humans, you are only 25 years old, and I am 250 years old this year. I am in the new generation of vampires. For us, this kind of feeling is inevitably a little sad, and most of it is not from our own feelings. Oh. Chapter 1236. Insursta's mouth was wide open. He was almost stunned. My God, you actually spouted so much nonsense just to refute me? Should I feel honored or at a loss for what to do? It seems like this is the first time since I've met you. And my old friend, your words sound a little like the 9 phoenixes. I didn't know you had the gift of a linguist. Tarkus glanced at him. I always have, you just didn't notice. Before my 100th birthday, I always thought I would become a scholar. The poor Black Lord rolled his eyes. Then what do you say we do? He pointed at Brando and then at Boban, who was next to him. That's Brando. You know who he is. The mighty lord of the Antiburo Principality. My God, if we bring these two back to the realm of eternal death, we'll be waiting for His Majesty to chop off our heads. Tarkus, however, looked in that direction and remained silent. Take one step at a time, he replied. That doesn't sound like something you would say, Tarkus. It doesn't sound like it, Tarkus replied. Because it is. For the first time, Insursta discovered that his friend actually had a talent for humor. Although he probably didn't think so himself. Now he was beginning to admit that Tarkus did indeed have the potential to become a scholar, because they were both neurotic, in his opinion. But that was of no use. 5th column, 7th line, 8th line. Delphian struggled to prop herself up on the ladder. Her face was as white as a thin sheet of paper, and sweat poured down like rain, densely covering her almost transparent skin. But she was careful not to let a single drop of sweat stain the bookshelf. That would be a fatal mistake and absolutely could not be allowed. Her gaze rested on one of the books. The bookshelf had traces of frequent looting, and the gilded title on the thick book spine was very ordinary. It was the genealogy of the Rosalins. At a glance, such a book seemed to have the value of being frequently looted. Some nobles liked to reminisce about their family's history. The more glorious the family's past, the more bleak the present, the more they liked it. The Rosalins seemed to fit this pattern, but Delphian's intuition told her that she had guessed correctly. She took a light breath and retracted her hand. She wiped the fine layer of sweat on her pure white wrist and palm with her skirt. This extremely rude action was something that she would never do on a normal day. That was something that only servants would do. But people were not born vulgar. Of course, it was the same for nobility. The Prime Minister's daughter wanted to prove this right now. After carefully wiping off her sweat, she moved the ladder closer and reached for the book in the corner of the bookshelf. Carefully, she tried to take out the book the way its original owner had taken it out. 5th column, 8th line, History of the Rosaline Family, page 332, 3rd paragraph between the 7th and 18th sentences. You found it very accurately. An abrupt voice suddenly rang out behind Delphian. It was a somewhat gentle voice, like a gentleman's careful voice, afraid of scaring her. But Delphian, who was highly strung up, was so frightened that she trembled. The thick book in her hand fell out of her hand and landed heavily on the thick carpet. She missed a step and fell backward. She screamed and fell from the air. She could not help but close her eyes. She remembered that there was a small table behind her. If she fell on it, she would most likely die. Countless complicated thoughts rushed out of her mind. She did not expect to fall short of success in the end. Perhaps it was just like what his grandfather had said about him. He was still too simple-minded and paranoid about this world. Martha had taught him this answer one by one, but in the end he still ignored all of it. What she thought of was not hatred, nor was it the empire burning in flames and the dying Silver Queen. In the chaotic illusion before her eyes, she saw the bright afternoon sun. She saw her grandfather's carriage slowly driving along the rose path into the green courtyard. Under the huge willow tree of the Nydevan family, The old man's figure became more and more crooked. The era of the giants had finally come to an end. After the supreme of the empire had obtained everything he needed, his daughter began to strip away the glory of this ancient family. She wanted revenge. For her grandfather, for her father, she wanted to take back the glory of the Nidevan family. She suddenly remembered the question Elman had asked her on a warm summer night when she and Elman were hugging by the side of the Lovers' River in the imperial capital. Delphian, tell me, do you care about my identity and the family behind me, or do you care about me? She remembered laughing at the time because that question was laughable. She remembered looking at that silly fellow with a teasing gaze. Elman, how can you be so naive? Are there any other things besides politics in the imperial capital's noble circle? I love you and I care about your family and your identity. If you were just a lowly person, I wouldn't be with you. Elman did not say anything at that time, as if he had silently agreed. Delphian suddenly felt a little disappointed. She suddenly realized that her love and hate were mixed with something that should not have been there. But when she came back to her senses, she found that she was not in Elman's warm embrace, but in the embrace of a stranger. The man looked at her with a smile. His hands wrapped around her ankles and shoulders and held her from behind. Before she could react, he placed her on the ground politely. She was barefoot, and she could feel the thick handmade carpet tickling her soles. It's too abrupt, but I can't help but like to show off. Bad habits are hard to change. The man looked at her. His black eyes were like two bright black gems. His long hair was draped over his shoulders. His appearance was somewhat feminine, but it definitely wouldn't make people think that he was feminine. He smiled at Delphian and said, "If I scared Miss Delphian, please forgive me." Feng Qi. Delphian leaned against the bookshelf, her face pale. She trembled slightly as she asked, "When did you come in?" She immediately realized that she had asked a stupid question. Her face darkened as she changed the topic. "Were you the one behind the voice at that time as well?" It only took a moment for her to realize what was going on. The voice she heard in her dreams when she was unconscious was this man's voice. It was completely different from his usual voice when he talked to Lord Rosaline, but now it was obvious. She was not stupid. She knew that she had been tricked. Lord Rosaline is too wary of us. I just needed someone who was less wary of him to explore his secrets. But the price of buying someone is too high. The people around him are either too mediocre, or too difficult to make a move on. Feng Qi did not hide from Delphian's accusation. He crossed his arms and shrugged. Only Miss Delphian has an interesting experience. I believe I didn't force you to do anything. Delphian's expression changed. She said angrily, "You peeped into my memories? I know it's not a good habit, but I just can't help it. I'm sorry. I hope you can forgive me." Feng Qi scratched his head awkwardly. "But you're a clean girl and I didn't see anything unnecessary. You have to believe me. And the details of your life don't exist on the surface of your consciousness. You should understand what I mean." Delphian's face was ashen. She gritted her teeth and glared at him. Just as she was about to explode, the man seemed to realize that he had gone too far. He quickly shut his mouth and changed his words. I'm sorry, but I have to explain myself. After all, this is related to my reputation." "Shut up." The Prime Minister's daughter squeezed out the two words from between her teeth. Okay, Miss Delphian. Please calm down. I'll listen to your orders." The man immediately raised his hands and said, "But I believe we still have a common topic. Since you've seen those things, I can roughly guess what you want to do. Your current actions also prove my thoughts. Our goals are the same." Delphian was silent for a moment. She wanted to explode, but she suppressed her impulse and asked coldly, "What do you want to do?" Feng Qi walked past her and bent down to pick up the book from the ground. He flipped through the pages and then closed the book. He looked up and said to her, "Miss Delphian, your help to us ends here. But you've given me a surprise. Perhaps you can solve the mystery of the jadeite." "You want me to solve the mystery of the jadeite? Why should I?" Delphian looked at him coldly. "I don't care if I die. I also don't want a great beauty like you to die, Miss Delphian," Feng Qi replied. "It's not that serious. This is just a transaction. You want to save the world and so do I. After all, neither of us wants to die. You should know that the jadeite heart only has one use." can also let you ascend to the throne, not just the 9 Phoenix. Delphian mercilessly exposed him. That's just a side effect. Feng Qi replied nonchalantly. Maybe it's a little important to me, but it doesn't mean anything to you, Miss Delphine. But we have a common enemy, and I can help you deal with him. I don't need. Really? Delphian's mouth moved, but she suddenly thought of something. She looked up at him and said, You plan to cause trouble for that person? There was a hint of a sneer in her tone. Actually, it's not a plan. Feng Qi took out a pocket watch from his sleeve and opened it to take a look. If my subordinates were punctual, they would have already caused trouble for him. Then you're in big trouble. Delphian looked at this guy a little pitifully and sneered. You'd better pray for yourself. Chapter 1237. After much effort, Lord Rosaline slowly regained consciousness. The first thing he did when he woke up was to get the knight to support him as he walked towards Brando with a complicated expression. His fat body trembled as he prostrated himself respectfully, intending to kiss Brando's boots to ask for forgiveness. He could not care less about the Rosaline family's dignity and his dignity at this moment. Of course, the Lord thought that this was nothing in front of the young man in front of him. He was not the most outstanding of the Rosaline family masters, but at least he was not stupid. Even though he had been frightened previously, he understood everything at this moment. Regardless of whether it was his guard captain or the young man in front of him, according to the saying of the 9 Phoenix region, they were legendary existences above the clouds. To these people, as long as the Rosaline family did not want to be removed from the Swift Plains, they could not afford to offend them. He was full of regret. He had agreed to work with the Ghost Chariot, thinking that they would protect him. He had thought so too. In a place like the Swift Plains, where the Emperor was far away, even the 9 Phoenix royal family could not do anything to him. After all, the extreme swordmasters of the Jade Phoenix bloodline would not easily leave the country. Those people still had to guard against the Ghost Chariot swordmasters from ambushing them outside the country's borders. Gaining the favor of the Ghost Chariot on this piece of land was a great thing for the Rosaline family. However, he did not expect that without foresight, there would be immediate trouble. The 9 Phoenix royal family had not made any moves, but he had kicked an iron plate in his own territory. Looking at the 2 people in front of him, the Lord of Rosaline had mixed feelings. Although one of them was his guard captain, or rather the former guard captain, his mind was not muddled. His heart was as clear as a mirror, and he knew that a person like Bobin would definitely not be willing to stay in a small place like Rosaline. Before his identity was exposed, he might have been able to conceal his identity and act as the guard captain of his family, but after he revealed his true strength, a place like Rosaline would no longer be able to keep him. Even if he really did stay here, it would be meaningless. Instead, he would bring unnecessary trouble to his family. Not to mention his family that had long since lost its glory. Even the famous families on the Swift Plains might not be able to provide him with a stage to perform. That was not a game that the Rosalines could participate in. His mind was clear, and he did not harbor such delusions. Although he had been suspicious of why the other party would hide in the Rosaline family, perhaps for the secret of his family, or for some other reason, it was no longer important at this moment. The most important thing was that as a smart person, he had to understand his current situation at all times. This was what the previous head of Rosaline's family, who was also his father, had taught him. Even though he was already over 50 years old, he still remembered this lesson with trepidation. He remembered that his father was the most outstanding patriarch of the Rosaline family in the past few generations. He was far from his father's level, but at least his father had one good point, which was that he knew his place. At this moment he could no longer care about Ghost Chariot's favor. If he did not do so, there would be no future for him. This Rosaline leader did not understand Brando, and neither did Blanche. He watched as the leader that he had brought up trembled as he knelt down and lowered his head to kiss the dust on Brando's boots. His expression did not change. He was not a cold-blooded person, but he was once the ruler of a country, and he no longer had such naive thoughts. He understood that if the other party wanted to survive in a chaotic place like Swift Plains, this was the attitude that the weaker party had to take. This had nothing to do with dignity because when one lacked the necessary strength, it was actually superfluous and might even be harmful. Just like what the Rosaline leader had thought, since he had already revealed the power of an ultimate grade Grand Swordmaster, he could no longer stay in this place. He had to leave eventually and could no longer protect this broken family left behind by the previous leader. After he left, the other party would have to rely on his own power to survive in Swift Plains. The Nine Phoenix might not be a world where the strong were respected, but in Swift Plains this kind of thinking was very popular. Blanche had been immersed in this culture for decades, so he was more or less influenced by this kind of thinking. However, Brando did not necessarily agree, especially when he saw this fat fellow like a ball crawling down in front of him and kissing his boots. Whether it was mentally or physically, he could not take it. With a lift of his hand, 3 silver lines appeared out of thin air and held the leader up. "No need, I am not that petty." Brando looked at the other party and replied. The leader of Rosaline raised his head to look at him in shock, and at the same time, he looked at Blanche who was beside him. Blanche nodded at him and replied, "Just listen to Mr. Brando. He is the descendant of an old friend of mine, so he will not make things difficult for you." The leader of Rosaline's expression changed before he finally heaved a sigh of relief. He looked at Brando, then at his guard captain, and his heart was filled with regret. When he thought about how he had led a group of ants to provoke the other party, he could not help but feel his molars ache. At the same time, he cursed his bad luck in his heart. However, who would have thought that a young man who looked like he was in his early 20s would have such power? The so-called 1-in-1,000 years genius of the Ghost Chariot lineage, Feng Qi, had been praised by the Ghost Chariot as if he was the best in the world. Before he had seen a higher level of power, he had indeed been fooled for a period of time, and was amazed by the young man's power. However, he could not help but curse in his heart, "What 1-in-1,000 years genius? He has really lived his life like a dog." He had already pushed the responsibility of his misjudgment of Brando's power to the most outstanding genius of the Ghost Chariot lineage in the past 1,000 years. Unfortunately, what he didn't know was that Phantom Chariot's talent aside, Brendel's strength was obtained through cheating, and there probably wouldn't be a second person in the world who could match him. However, he was not the only one who had such thoughts. He was also amazed by Brando's power. However, he was not amazed by Brando's absolute power. He was not as ignorant as the former. He knew that there were some ancient inheritances in Wone that could rapidly increase a person's power. These inheritances were hard to come by for ordinary people, but they were not as rare as one would imagine for a descendant of a marshal of the Empire's allied forces. At least he knew that Sir Darius and Her Majesty should have obtained some inheritances related to the Dark Dragon during the last battle. However, what really amazed him was the state of Brando's swordsmanship. This was something that could only be achieved through the accumulation of time and extraordinary talent. During their battle, he could easily feel that this descendant of the marshal had reached the final step in his swordsmanship. He was only one step away from the highest state of a warrior. There were such swordmasters in Wone and even in Cruz. At least as far as he knew, there were a few within the Empire. However, there was no one like Brando who was only 20 years old or even 50 years old. Regarding a freak like Brando, Brando could only sigh in his heart. No wonder he had the monstrous bloodline of the Darius family. He was exactly the same as his grandfather. Brando glanced at Lord Rosaline, who was standing there respectfully. He knew that he had convinced Lord Rosaline. Of course, he also knew that Deputy Marshal Brando had contributed to this. Even though he wasn't sure what Lord Rosaline's attitude was, at least for now, he should be considered friendly. He turned back to look at Huang Hua. The little girl was also staring at him with a hint of anticipation in her dark eyes. Brando knew what the princess of the Nine Phoenix royal family wanted him to ask, so he nodded. He turned back again and said to Lord Rosaline, "Even though I know that there is only a misunderstanding between us, Lord Rosaline, I also know that this misunderstanding didn't happen by chance, right?" Lord Rosaline's heart skipped a beat. He knew that Brendel wasn't stupid. Even though he had expected this question, he still couldn't help but be stuck at this moment. He knew that no matter how he answered, he would definitely offend either party. He hoped that Brando wouldn't ask this question, but he also knew that just like how he knew about Brendel's existence, this young man definitely knew about their existence too. To be honest, He was more unwilling to offend Ghost Chariot because the Rosaline family had to establish themselves in the Swift Plains. Even if this young man agreed to protect him, he couldn't possibly stay here all the time. However, Ghost Chariot's lineage had been rooted here for many years, and its sphere of influence had long been deeply rooted. Anyone who wanted to make a living on this land would never choose to offend Ghost Chariot. More realistically, if he dared to say no, he felt that the Rosaline family would disappear even further. That young man seemed to be easy to talk to, but who knew if his sword was just as easy to talk to? He might still have the compassion and benevolence of a young man, but that didn't mean that he was a fool. He said dryly. Then he saw something in the eyes of his former guard captain and stammered, Yes. In other words, you and your knight are looking for trouble with me not because I caused trouble in your inn this afternoon, but because of another reason, right? This. Chapter 1238. Brando could have asked Blanche, but he didn't choose to do so. Although he didn't know why the vice-marshal was here, he could tell from his attitude towards the Lord that he had some feelings for this place. He felt that if he were to ask, the other party might give him the real answer. However, that would seem like a betrayal to the Rosaline family. Perhaps the other party would not be calculative on account of his grandfather, but Lindley did not want to owe the other party a favor. Besides, he didn't think that he wouldn't be able to convince the Lord, who didn't seem like a tough nut to crack. I heard what you said just now, Lord, Brendel reminded him. What? What did I say? You intend to let your knight attack Phoenix Hua. As a lord, you won't be calculative with a little girl over such a small matter, right? This. All right, Lord, I want to hear the truth. You don't have to worry about anyone finding trouble for you. With me here, no one will dare to attack you. Indeed, it's here. The Rosaline lord couldn't help but laugh bitterly. If possible, he was willing to believe that this young man had the ability, but he obviously couldn't stay in the Swift Plains forever. He could protect himself for a while, but could he protect the Rosaline family forever? But he knew that he had to make a choice. It depended on whether the Rosaline family would be finished now or after this incident. The latter might still have a chance to turn things around, but it would inevitably be like drinking poison to quench one's thirst. Brando obviously understood the hesitation in the Rosaline lord's heart. Just as he was about to add more to shake the lord's resolve, Phoenix was suddenly spoke. My lord, the Ghost Chariot isn't your only choice. In the history of the Nine Phoenix, they are just a bunch of losers. The Nine Phoenix welcomes all law-abiding people, and the Rosaline family doesn't have to stay in the Swift Plains. The little girl, who had always been taciturn and courteous, spoke to the Lord of Rosaline and everyone present with a serious expression. My lord, your family has left Swift Plains for decades. Why don't you choose a brighter path instead of staying here with the anomalies? Be it for the sake of your family or your people. Are you not willing to see the Rosaline family prosper in your hands? This. Lord Rosaline was completely dumbfounded. He was still unsure of this little girl's true identity. Although Ghost Chariot's people had told him that she was a direct descendant of the Jade Phoenix bloodline of the Nine Phoenix royal family, there were many direct descendants of the Jade Phoenix bloodline, and very few people could say such a thing. Moreover, she was just a little girl. No matter how he looked at it, it was impossible for her to be the Nine Phoenix crown princess. If she was really the Nine Phoenix crown princess, he wouldn't dare to cause trouble for Huang Hua even if he had 100 guts. It was a pity that Lord Rosaline didn't expect Huang Hua's identity to be much nobler than he had imagined. In the Nine Phoenix Kingdom, the position of the crown princess wasn't fixed, but there were only a few Jade Phoenix mages' descendants in history. The former only required qualifications, while the latter required a special bloodline. Trust her. She can be responsible for her words, Brando said to him. However, he also looked at Huang Hua strangely. Of course, he could tell that the mountain of flesh in front of him was tempted. The little girl's words seemed to have scratched the itch in his heart at the right time. The Lord was already wavering, and it was only a matter of time before he changed sides. In fact, Huang Hua didn't promise much, and she didn't make any promises. Brando didn't expect this little girl, who looked a little silly and innocent, to be able to say such rigorous and watertight words with a straight face. He walked to her side. Huang Hua bowed slightly to him and explained softly, Mr. Brando, you don't have to be surprised. After all, Huang Hua is also a member of the 9 Phoenix royal family. I will also learn what my brothers and sisters want to learn. No, Brando replied. But you are only 10 years old, right? In the 9 Phoenix, Huang Hua has always been a little smarter than the others. The little girl smiled and replied cheekily, but in front of Mr. Brando, she is far inferior. Brando looked at her with some surprise. He seemed to have guessed something from her words. You want to learn swordsmanship from me? Huang Hua shook her head. After watching the battle between you and that person, Huang Hua understood that it is impossible for Huang Hua to go too far on the path of swordsmanship. Hearing what she said, Brando's eyes flashed with a strange light. You can see that too? I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I have this idea in my heart. Brando couldn't help but gasp. This little girl's talent was too terrifying. She could even sense such things with her intuition. It was simply incredible. He once thought that it was ridiculous enough that he had the system, but compared to this little girl it seemed to be nothing. After all, the system could only help him in terms of absolute strength. After reaching the supreme state, the only thing left to help him was to digitize this world. However, Huang Hua's talent could help her continue on this path. She might be slower than him at the beginning, but after reaching a certain level, she would be well prepared. She might even break through all the way to the true perfect body. Why is there such a person in this world? Brando couldn't help but feel a throbbing in his heart. Huang Hua didn't belong to this era. Her era obviously wouldn't come until she fully grew up. In the Amber Sword, that should be at least after the year of the Starfire. When she started on this path, wouldn't it be after the twilight of the game? Then how many people like Huang Hua were there in this world? Was she still immortal? Brando frowned as he looked at Huang Hua. He vaguely saw something in her. If her potential represented the future of the Iron Folk, then perhaps Martha's plan was not impossible. At this moment he suddenly understood why he was thrown into this place after passing through the space-time rift, and why he suddenly met these people and a somewhat strange little girl like Huang Hua. Perhaps this was not a coincidence. Actually, I'm not a swordsman, Huang Hua. Just when Huang Hua was a little uncomfortable under his gaze, Brando suddenly let out a long breath and said, I'm a warrior. Mr. Brando is not a swordsman? Huang Hua asked with some surprise. But Mr. Brando's sword is obviously the ultimate sword. It's not that a warrior can't use a sword, but it's not only the sword saint who uses a sword, Brando replied. Swordsmen always rely on their swords, but as a warrior, you can only rely on your own heart that has experienced hundreds of battles. That is a path that is carved out from the slaughter of beasts. Without experiencing hundreds of deaths, you will never understand it. Teacher, Huang Hua is willing to learn the way of the warrior. Huang Hua's eyes lit up slightly. Nirvana after 100 deaths. Isn't this the way of the Jade Phoenix? She had a faint premonition in her heart, as if this was the path that belonged to her. Brando did not answer her directly. He just smiled and patted her on the head. I can't always stay in 9 Phoenix. Huang Hua, as the successor of the Jade Phoenix, you can't go to Erewhon with me. On the way to Green Jade Hill, let's see how much you can learn. Huang Hua shook her head and respectfully bowed to him as a disciple. She said, once a teacher, always a father. I don't dare to go against this principle. Everyone liked obedient students, and Brando was naturally the same. He was very satisfied with Huang Hua's attitude. At this moment, he could not help but think of Haruz, who was far away in Erewhon. Both of his students could be said to be excellent, but it was a pity that he was not a wizard. He and the little prince were teacher and student in name, but they were not teachers and students. In fact, when he returned to Erewhon, he planned to let Senior teach the little prince. In terms of familiarity with black magic, Senior was one of the best in the whole of Erewhon, even though she was only an elementalist in her previous life. While Brando and Huang Hua were talking, Lord Rosaline, who was standing in the middle of the street, made up his mind. Just like what Brando had seen, he was indeed moved at the first moment. Even though he was not excellent enough, he was like the ancestors of the Rosaline family. There was not a moment when he did not want to restore the glory of his family. Why did he want to cooperate with the Ghost Chariot? He had no choice but to go to Swift Plains to seek refuge. Otherwise, he could have just handed over the mystery of the jade to the Ghost Chariot, but he did not. In fact, in the depths of his heart, He might have wanted to restore the glory of the Rosaline family to its most glorious era. Even though he did not have the ability, he coincidentally knew a secret that the previous masters of the family had never discovered. The Rosaline family only lacked an opportunity, and now this opportunity had appeared in front of him. What was Swift Plains? What was the Ghost Chariot? Although the overlords of the Swift Plains claimed that they didn't care about the Nine Phoenix, everyone knew that it was because they knew that the Nine Phoenix wouldn't come to such a desolate place. If there was an opportunity, who would not want to develop in the Nine Phoenix? It was the same for the Rosaline family. The only thing that he was hesitant about was whether the little girl's words were trustworthy, but he got the answer from Brando's eyes. In the end, this guard captain did not abandon the Rosaline family. He could not help but feel touched. Perhaps Brando was really staying here because of his father's kindness, but it was not the first time that he had doubts about him. It was a pity that this kind of repayment ended here. He could not help but feel that it was a pity. Thinking of this, the Lord lifted his head and said to Brando, who was not far away, "My lord, it's the Ghost Chariot. It's the people from the Ghost Chariot who are manipulating everything behind the scenes. Their target is Miss Huang Hua." Brando smiled and turned his head back from his conversation with Huang Hua. He had no experience with this, as he had already expected it. He looked at the Lord and said, "I'm not familiar with the Ghost Chariot, but I'm sure you've had dealings with them before. If I'm not wrong, they wouldn't just send you to die as cannon fodder, right?" The Rosaline Lord's face turned red, but humans were strange. He was not angry at Brando's mockery. Instead, he resented the Ghost Chariot. If not for these fellows not telling him anything and letting him come here to kick an iron plate, would the Rosaline family be in such a dilemma? In his opinion, those fellows were clearly treating him as cannon fodder. Thinking of this, he could not help but feel indignant. He nodded and said, "Mr. Brando is right. The people from the Ghost Chariot asked me to delay you. Their people seem to have gone to the dock. Now that I think about it, they knew that my people couldn't stop you, so they probably planned to ambush you there." Since he already had such a thought, the Lord did not hold back and directly told him about the Ghost Chariot's plan. Of course, he did not know what the Ghost Chariot's plan was, but they were moving around in his territory, so he knew where they went. But he had actually wronged Fang Qi and the others. No matter how smart the Ghost Chariot was, it was impossible for them to guess Brando's strength out of thin air. In Delphian's memory, Fang Qi had seen him fighting with the supreme masters of Cruz's people. Unfortunately, as a normal person, the daughter of the Prime Minister could not remember every detail of the battle at that time. More importantly, the memories of mortals would never leave the existence of miracles, so Delphian did not leave any memories of Archangel Iroma in her subconscious. So, in the eyes of the Ghost Chariot and the others, Brando was at most an expert with the strength of an eternal end. According to Won's grading system, it was the level of the elemental truth to the peak of the law. Based on his age, it might be even lower. So they wishfully thought that Lord Rosaline and his knight, as well as the guard captain who might have some strength, should have no problem delaying Brando and the others. Even if they could not defeat them, it would be enough to delay them. Their real target was actually Mr. Liu, who was heading to the port area. This guard of the Nine Phoenix royal family naturally made them extremely wary. After hearing the Lord of Rosaline's description, Brendel instantly understood the other party's thoughts. He did not know how strong the Ghost Chariot was in Rosaline, but since the guy named Fang Qi was also here, it should not be too bad. He immediately frowned, feeling that Mr. Liu's current situation might not be too good. However, the people from the Ghost Chariot should have set off for some time. Even if Mr. Liu was in trouble, it would have been a while. Even if he and Huang Hua rushed over, it would be useless. Maybe the other party would even ambush them there. "My lord, do you have a topographic map of the port area in your castle?" Brendel's eyes brightened when he thought about the ambush. "My lord, do you have a map of the port area in your castle?" The latter immediately understood what he meant and quickly said, "Of course there is. In fact, there is a secret passage in the city that leads to the port area without being noticed by everyone." At this point he added a little embarrassedly, "That was the escape route left behind by our ancestors when they built the castle." "Very good. Now it's our turn to ambush them." Brando replied with satisfaction. Although he had taken Huang Hua as his student, He could not always play hide-and-seek with the people from the ghost chariot. If he could get rid of these guys once and for all, he did not mind helping Huang Hua and Mr. Lu. Moreover, adding some trouble to Madara's plan in the east was also beneficial to his physical and mental health. Chapter 1239. After completely siding with the Nine Phoenix royal family, Rosaline no longer held back. He immediately ordered his subordinates to return to the castle to retrieve the distribution map of Rosaline's establishment. To be on the safe side, he also ordered Kasaf, the captain of the night team that Brando had met earlier at the Quzong's river. He was one of the last knights to arrive. At that moment, he was overjoyed that he had avoided a disaster. He was no longer as arrogant as before towards Brando and Phoenix Fire. He was careful and respectful to lead his subordinates to follow them and guard against Ghost Chariot's interference. However, he also understood that the probability of Ghost Chariot going to such great lengths to intercept such a distribution map was close to zero. He was only doing this to show that he was willing to cooperate with them. Brando was quite satisfied with his attitude. This Rosaline lord did not seem to be very capable, but at least he was sensible enough. That was enough. In times like these, he always preferred sensible people. Kasaf and his subordinates quickly left, leaving only the others to accompany Brando and Insursta in the cold wind. After September, even the sea breeze at Rosaline Harbor was somewhat dry. The biting cold wind from the sea made one's face hurt, but without Brando's approval, most of the people present did not dare to express their dissatisfaction. As the Lord of Rosaline, the plump city lord naturally lived like a prince. Even if the weather was a little bad, he would not be willing to go out, let alone this unpleasant autumn wind. But at this moment, his expression seemed to be one of joy. To be able to chat with Brendel, or rather, to be able to answer Brendel's questions, was enough to make him feel extremely honored. Speaking of which, not to mention Rosaline, even in the swift plains, how many people could converse with the celestial beings above the clouds at any time? Because of Lord Rosaline's attitude, Brando quickly understood the situation here. With Deputy Marshal Brando's occasional confirmation, he roughly grasped the cooperation between Ghost Chariot and the people here. Just as he had expected, the Ghost Chariot was the most powerful force in the swift plains, but their cooperation with Lord Rosaline was not as straightforward as he had imagined. Normally, as the more powerful party, the Ghost Chariot would rarely exchange any meaningful opinions with Rosaline. Most of the time it was a one-sided order. This was because the Rosaline family needed their protection. Since they needed help and were far weaker than the other party, there was no need to talk about cooperation. This was a very normal thing. Since this was the case, the cooperation between both parties was not as sincere as imagined. Otherwise, Lord Rosaline would not have been immediately moved by Phoenix Fire's suggestion. Brando also noticed that Lord Rosaline was always evasive when it came to this, so he could not help but suspect that there was more to the cooperation between both parties. However, this had nothing to do with him, so he let Lord Rosaline be. He did not pursue the matter, nor did he confirm it with Marshal Brando. His magnanimity surprised Lord Rosaline, and he became even more determined to stand on the side of the Nine Phoenix royal family. Other than that, the locals did not know much about their cooperation. The only thing Brando knew about Ghost Chariot was that Fang Qi, whom Phoenix Fire and Mr. Lu called the 1-in-1,000-years genius of the Ghost Chariot clan, might be staying near Rosaline at this moment. However, Lord Rosaline did not dare to confirm this piece of information. However, Huang Hua had told him that Fang Qi was one of the core members of the Ghost Chariot, so he might have two elders accompanying him at all times. Luin asked about the strength of these Ghost Chariot elders and learned that they were about the same level as Mr. Bobin, which meant that they were half a meter. Of course, their battle experience was far inferior to the veterans of the November War. Brando was known as the White Wolf of the Far region. 60 years ago, his swordsmanship had reached perfection, and he was the strongest existence among the 12 deputy marshals. Even if the other party still had strength on the surface, according to Brendel's attitude of being lenient to the enemy, he should have no problem dealing with the Ghost Chariot with the help of the Great Elder, or even a genuine supreme-class expert. Almost a quarter of an hour had passed during the conversation, but the knights still needed some time to reach the castle. During Brando's conversation with Lord Rosaline, he noticed more than once that the young man named Seabass, the adopted son of Na Exen, wanted to come to his side a few times. However, he seemed to be hesitant and did not dare to come over in the end. However, his actions attracted Brando's attention. He thought of something and took out the diary. Previously, because his attention was diverted by Lord Rosaline's knights, he put the diary in his pocket and did not have time to read it. Now that he had recalled this matter, he was a little curious. He thought to himself that he was not familiar with this place, so who would pass the message to him? Now, it seemed that it was impossible for Mr. Liu to do so. Could it be this fellow's secret enemy? Brando could not help but look at Lord Rosaline in front of him. Although the latter saw Brando take out the diary, he did not notice it. In fact, he did not know that it was a diary. He flipped open the diary and thought that if this was a message from the Lord's secret enemy, then he would just pretend that he didn't see it. In any case, this person was now considered an ally, and his attitude was quite good. Regardless of whether it was for Marshal Blanche or Phoenix Fire, he had no reason to go back on his words. Brando first apologized to this potential friend in his heart. Then he flipped to page 177 according to Seabass instructions. Counting the pages might take some time for an ordinary person, but for a person with high perceptive perception like him, it only took a moment. When he saw the words written in crooked handwriting on the page, his gaze suddenly froze. At first glance, he could tell that the words were written by a non-dominant hand. Although the person tried to cover it up, he could still tell that it was written by a woman. The other party had made a lot of details in the words. To an ordinary person it was almost flawless, but he was not an ordinary person. Tolman was a scholar who specialized in ancient languages. When Brando first met him, he naturally asked for the knowledge and experience of similar scholars. Tolman's attainment in the language could be said to be better than Erwin and many of the half-baked staff who worked in the reference room and the Royal Library. The text message on the page read, "The real purpose of the ghost chariot in Rosaline was to covet the stone notebook found by the 17th generation of the Rosaline family, because this notebook recorded a long-rumored secret, the mystery of the emerald. The people of Nine Phoenix believe that the mystery of the Emerald Dragon contains information about the whereabouts of the heart of the Emerald Dragon, which is also known as the Heart of the Emerald. After my investigation, I found that it is actually the Pearl of Nature. Mr. Brando, if you are still concerned about this news, please come to Rosaline Castle to find me." Brando tore the page with a snap, then crumpled it into a ball and put it in his pouch. Whether it was the mystery of the emerald or the heart of the Emerald Dragon, he did not care about them. There were so many treasures in this world, and he could not have them all. Moreover, after seeing the treasures of the Termosian people outside the elemental barrier, it could be said that his vision had improved a lot, and his interest in these treasures of the lower realm had faded a lot. However, the last few words on the note deeply touched him. The 7 divine swords. The Pearl of Nature. Naturally, that was something he was determined to get. But now he was more concerned about whether this thing was real or not. Who was the person who sent him this diary? How did they know that he needed this thing now? And it seemed like the other party knew him, otherwise he would not have been able to call out his name. He had just entered the city today, and even if the other party was the archenemy of Lord Rosaline, it was impossible for them to investigate him so thoroughly. He raised his head and looked at Seabass, who was not far away. The latter's hair stood on end under his gaze, and it felt like he was being stared at by a hunting beast. Brando raised the diary, which had a feminine aura, and waved it in front of the other party. "Who asked you to deliver it?" The youth was stunned, then shook his head vigorously. "Sir, I can't say. But didn't you say that as long as I read this diary I can tell you?" "This?" Seabass glanced at Lord Rosaline, who was not far away. He thought to himself, "That was then, this is now. If I were to mention Miss Delphine's name in front of Lord Rosaline, wouldn't I be betraying her?" Brando saw through his gaze, so he turned to Lord Rosaline and asked, "Do you know him?" Lord Rosaline looked at Seabass in confusion. Fortunately, he was not a truly important person. Even though there were many servants in Rosaline Castle, it was not to the extent that he did not recognize his own blacksmith's apprentice. "I think I know him." Lord Rosaline raised his head and said angrily, "Who are you and why are you here? How dare you not answer Sir's question?" He then explained to Brando with a bashful face, "Sir, He is still a child and is not very sensible. Please don't be angry. I will immediately explain to him what is going on. Brando shook his head. There is no need for that. This is a clever lad, and he is a good person. Seabass was still a little uneasy at first. After all, he did not know the consequences of going against the will of an important person. His uncle, Xianzheng, who was behind him, kept winking at him, but for Miss Delphian he was ready to go all out. P.S. As usual, the progress did not follow my expectations. Clack clack clack. The world is indeed peaceful, and everything is normal. Silently vomiting blood. Chapter 1240. However, he did not expect Brando to say such a thing, and the dark-skinned youth was overjoyed. He knew that this young man's position in his lord's heart was very important, and Brando's words were a great help to him. As expected, he saw his lord giving him a look of praise, and he could not help but feel elated. At the same time he felt a little guilty. No matter what, he still could not answer Brendel's question. He did not know that Brendel actually did not need to get any information from him. From Lord Rosaline's reply, Brendel knew that this letter should be from within Rosaline Castle. Then this person's identity was somewhat interesting. The other party seemed to be a female. Brando could not help but turn around and ask, "My lord, do you have any spies in the castle? If you send someone to retrieve the blueprint, will they threaten your family?" Rosaline shook his head. "Don't worry, my lord. I am usually alone. Even though I have 2 sons, they are not in Rosaline right now." But when he said this, he suddenly paused and revealed a somewhat hesitant expression. Brando thought to himself that he did not even have a daughter. That was strange. Other than that, what other women would have a higher status in the castle? Could it be that the butler was a woman? Other than Ondina and Flofa, he had not seen any other nobles using female butlers. Hence, Makarov and the rest looked at him strangely. In fact, Tonajul and Radner had said that he was a lecherous man. It was not that he did not know about such rumors. Brando did not notice Rosaline's expression immediately, and asked casually, "My lord, do you have any guests in the castle?" He did not expect that his casual question would cause such a huge reaction from the other party. Rosaline immediately stuttered, as though he had suddenly thought of something, but could not say it out loud. If he had not noticed the flash of hesitation in Lord Rosaline's eyes before, he could not help but notice the huge change now. He wondered if he had hit the nail on the head. He subconsciously asked, "What is it, my lord?" Rosaline opened his mouth and was about to answer, but at this moment, a group of people riding on wingless dragons rushed over in a panic, causing the stones on the ground to jump up. Brando turned around and saw that those people were Kasaf and his men that he had sent out earlier. Before they even got close, they saw Brando and his lord and shouted, "Bad news! My lord, Miss Delphian has been taken away by Ghost Chariot's men." "What?" Rosaline's expression immediately changed, as though his worries had come true. He swayed on his horse, and if it was not for Brando's quick reflexes, he would have fallen off his horse again. At the same time, Brando heard another shout from behind him. "What?" He heard it clearly. It was the voice of the young man called Seabass. Brando's heart was suddenly clear, as he had heard it clearly. Miss Delphian has been taken away by Ghost Chariot's men. There might be many people in this world named Delphian, but he did not doubt that Miss Delphian was the daughter of the Prime Minister. Although he was not sure how she came here, or how she knew that he was looking for the nature pearl, the contents of the letter in his hand had proven everything. No wonder he felt that the writing style was familiar. Back at Fathom Port, this Prime Minister's daughter had been doing paperwork for him, and he had seen many of her reports on the front line and supplies. When he heard this name, Brando could not help but frown. Back at Fathom Port, he had forgiven this woman, and after that, she seemed to have let go of her hatred. However, later on in Rushta, when the Roman's aunt went to the Cat and Beard Inn to save the waitress, she discovered something. Later on, she had privately mentioned this matter to him in the White Rose Garden. Although he was not completely sure, when the Roman was plotted against by the tree herders, this Prime Minister's daughter might have played a part in it. Brando actually believed this at that time. Later on, he had carefully thought about Delphian's motives. She had meticulously planned to help him fight against the Empire, and on the surface it was for the Nidevan family. However, this statement was a little abrupt, and not only him, but Medisha and Amandina had also reminded him more than once. Even the little princess, who was usually aloof from worldly affairs, had a conflict with her. In fact, he knew in his heart that her intentions were not that simple, but when this woman was caught in the dragon flames, she was indeed a little pitiful. For the sake of the silver dragon lady, he had agreed to let go of his hatred. But later on, he realized that Delphian had done this to create an irreconcilable hatred between him and the Silver Queen. Because the empire could not be overturned, the hatred would continue. She just did not expect the Silver Queen's final outcome, or else her target of revenge would not only be him, but also the entire kingdom of Erewhon. After the trip to the elemental barrier, especially after the battle with Dusk, he gradually understood this matter. It could only be said that this woman's heart was really too crazy. He recalled the time at Fathom Port, the Prime Minister's daughter who often buried herself in writing records in the study room. The sunlight that penetrated through the grated window fell on her body, and she seemed so quiet and skilled. He really could not believe that such a woman's heart could be so vicious and paranoid. Thinking of this, Brando could not help but hesitate. First, he doubted whether the letter was real or fake. No matter how Delphian knew that he was looking for the nature's orb, after playing the trick of crying wolf for so many times, it was natural for people to have this kind of association, which made him suspect that the woman was lying. To be exact, he did not want to save such a woman, nor did he want to have any dealings with her. In fact, because of the Roman's experience, if she was in front of him at this moment, it was still a question whether he could control himself from killing her. On the other hand, there was only one nature's orb in this world, and it might be the only way to save this world and save the Roman. If he missed this opportunity, who knew how much time he would have to waste? If the nature's orb was really in Nine Phoenix, he did not know when he would be able to return here. Going back and forth would take almost a year. While he was still hesitating, Lord Rosaline could not help but say, "My lord, Miss Delphian is the most distinguished guest in my territory." He subconsciously looked at Brendel and Blanche with pleading eyes, but he did not dare to say the words out loud. There was no such thing as a free lunch in this world, and he could make the Rosaline family owe him a favor if it was someone else. However, to someone like Brando, a favor from the Rosaline family was not worth much. In fact, Brando did not need to turn around to feel that the young man named Seabass was also looking at him with a burning gaze. Thinking of Delphian's usual behavior, he could not help but shake his head. He thought to himself that this woman really liked to play with people's hearts. It was impossible for him to have any good feelings towards such a person. However, Huang He did not know that the person at the center of this topic was such a person. She could not help but show a look of disgust. The people from the ghost chariot actually kidnapped a lady. They are getting more and more despicable. However, she did not ask her teacher to help. In Nine Phoenix, a teacher was like a father. The decision of the elders was not something that the juniors could interfere with. Brando did not say anything. He made the best choice, which was to pass the crumpled letter to Huang He. Huang He was slightly stunned. She raised her head and looked at him with her clear black and white eyes, puzzled. "Take a look. This might have something to do with the royal family of Nine Phoenix," Brando answered. Huang He nodded seriously. She opened the crumpled letter, glanced at it and cried out in surprise. Then she raised her head and looked at Lord Rosaline, who was not far away, with a burning gaze. "My lord, do you know about the mystery of Emerald?" Lord Rosaline's expression changed immediately. He looked at Huang He suspiciously, then at Brando. Huang He seemed a little anxious. The mystery of Emerald was related to the legitimacy of the royal family. For a long time, the Jade Phoenix bloodline and their allies had been searching for the whereabouts of the heart of the Azure Dragon in Nine Phoenix. They did not expect the Ghost Chariot clan to take the lead here. She had previously asked Brando for help in a hurry, which was actually against the etiquette of the Nine Phoenix. However, as a daughter of the royal family, she had to put down her reservations for this matter. One could imagine how important this secret was. Her fixed gaze seemed to have seen through Lord Rosaline's heart. She immediately said, "My lord, no one knows better than the Jade Phoenix bloodline what the mystery of Emerald means to the Rosaline family. The Nine Phoenix can give you what the Ghost Chariot clan cannot. You should know what I'm talking about." Lord Rosaline seemed to have understood at once. He turned to look at Mr. Bobin, who nodded at him immediately. As an important minister of the Rosaline family in the previous dynasty, the Marshal obviously knew some of the secrets of the Rosaline family. The mystery of Emerald might mean the legitimacy of the Nine Phoenix bloodline, but to the Rosaline family, it was just a bargaining chip. If they wanted to rely on this thing to ascend to the throne of the Nine Phoenix, they were really thinking too much. Lord Rosaline obviously understood this. He suppressed the ambition in his heart and quickly nodded at Brando and Huang Hua. Brando's heart sank immediately. He was almost certain that Delphian did not lie to him about this matter. The mystery of Emerald was indeed in the hands of the Rosaline family, and that thing was very likely related to the whereabouts of the nature pearl. Then, he had no choice but to take action. Chapter 1241. He had made up his mind. Even though Lord Rosaline had said that there was a secret passage in the castle that led to the port, Brando did not need any secret passage at all. He took the map of the port from the knight and glanced at it casually. He memorized the terrain of the main entrances and exits, then returned the map. After rejecting Lord Rosaline's request for assistance, he entrusted Phoenix's fire to the former Grand Duke of Antiburo, Blanche, to take care of her. That young lady was quiet and did not express any opinion, but her expression showed that she was not satisfied. Mr. Tarkus, he thought for a moment, then turned to the vampire and said, "Now I need you to do me a favor. Go to the Pirates' Bay now and let your ship sail out to sea. Seal off the waters near Rosaline. Since you usually pretend to be pirates, you shouldn't lack weapons on board, right?" Tarkus glanced at Insursta and knew that he had to help. He nodded. Relying on two fast sailing ships to seal off Rosaline's port was almost an impossible task. Even though the port was remote in Taiga Strait, it could handle at least dozens of ships, including fishing boats. But now, thanks to Lord Rosaline's order to seal off the port, it was not impossible to give it a try. Besides, Brando did not expect Madara's two-masted sailing ships to block the Chariot Ghost's men. It would be enough as long as they could hold them off at sea. At that moment, he had already memorized the layout of the port area. He remembered the main entrances and exits, but he was still worried that the other party would have an escape route that he did not know about. After all, even Madara had left an escape route nearby. How could the Chariot Ghost, whose forces were more deeply rooted in this area, not have a backup plan? After making all the preparations, he came to Insursta's side. The latter was shocked. Of course he knew what Brando was going to do. Since he had let Tarkus leave alone, he would definitely keep him as a hostage. But that was not what he was concerned about. "Don't stop. I have flying boots." Insursta's face changed drastically. He quickly raised his hand to stop Brando from approaching. "That's too slow." Brando shook his head regretfully. He grabbed the guy by the collar and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Insursta. No, I don't need your apology. Put me down. Damn it, you can't embarrass a dark noble like this." Tarkus raised his head and silently watched his colleague and Brando disappear into the air. Then, he turned around and bowed to Brando, Phoenix Hua, and the others before leaving without saying a word. "So it's a big bat." Seeing Tarkus's movements, Blank curled his lips. "What makes you say that, Mr. Bobin?" Phoenix Fire retracted her gaze from the southeast. That was the direction of the port in Rosaline City. Only these fellows would be so courteous to their enemies. They have the longest history among the Dark Nobles. Their attitude is probably due to their sense of superiority, Blank replied. He then turned to Huang Hua and said, "Call me Blank, young lady." "How do you do, Mr. Blank?" That afternoon, many Rosaline residents heard a terrifying scream in the air. But the Insursta dragon eventually shut its mouth when it was close to the port area. It was not because he cared about the big picture, but because he knew that if he did not shut up, the bastard who carried him in circles in the air above Rosaline would shut up for him. Once was enough for him to be embarrassed. The Black Lord did not want his reputation to be known in Madara's history in such a way. Brando was indeed satisfied with this guy's understanding of the situation. He landed near the port and among the sheds outside the port. It was not that he did not have an invisibility spell. There were many similar camouflage spells among the low-circle spells of the elementalists, but he did not think that his poor magic ability could deceive the existence of the supreme class in the Ghost Chariot, so he landed in advance. Anyway, with his current ability, moving on the ground was not much more troublesome than moving in the air. He just wanted to save some trouble. He first dropped the future star of Madara in his hand. The latter screamed and expressed great dissatisfaction with his behavior of forcibly dropping a guest. However, Brando ignored him. If the Black Lord of Madara, who had elemental awakening strength, could fall to his death from a height of less than 3 meters, then the kingdom of the Dead Moon would be doomed. Seeing that Brando ignored him, the latter got up, patted the dust off his body, and complained in a low voice. Then he began to complain that his clothes were wrinkled, his hair was messed up, and the makeup on his face was ruined. This was intolerable for a dark noble. Brando was looking around the place where he landed and found that the sheds here should be where the workers on the dock lived. It was now evening, the time when the workers went home after a busy day, but there were not many adult men in the sheds. Only some women and children in ragged clothes looked at the two uninvited guests who fell from the sky with some fear. A few children who were chasing saw them and stopped with some vigilance. Immediately, women ran out from the nearby sheds and dragged them back. Insursta looked at this scene and stopped. "It doesn't look good, my lord. What do you think?" Brando looked back. He knew how smart this guy was. History had proven him to be a genius more than once. "Well." Insursta lowered his head and looked at his wrinkled shirt with some regret. "This shirt was given to me by His Majesty the Emperor. I haven't worn it for long." Brando was suddenly speechless. "I didn't know that your Supreme had such a hobby." His Majesty always sympathizes with his subjects. He probably felt that his excuse was a little unreliable and added, "My lord, you should know that the dark nobles have always been very concerned about their appearance." "Is that so? Why didn't I know about this?" "The liches of Rover never seem to wear clothes, so much so that some scholars think that they are somewhat immoral." "Ahem, that's an exception, my lord. Look at Tarkus. Mr. Tarkus is a vampire nobleman." "Well, actually I also yearn for the style of those old nobles." Insursta's two black holes, the soul fire dancing in his two soulless eyes, could not help but be a little resentful. Of course, Brando knew that this guy was actually indirectly expressing his dissatisfaction with his previous actions. Although his relationship with Insursta and Tarkus was a little delicate, and both sides could not be considered allies, it might be more appropriate to say that they were rivals. It was just that he had the absolute advantage, and the other party did not dare to act rashly. But he also understood that he could not force these two guys into a desperate situation. The old-fashioned and stubborn Tarkus was better off, especially the guy in front of him, who knew what kind of schemes he had in his mind. He hoped that this Dark Lord would leave his thoughts to scheme against him in the realm of eternal death, and not cause trouble for him here. Thus, he glanced at the other party and replied, "Only this time. There won't be a next time." "Ha, that's great. You mean it?" "If we don't encounter such a situation next time. In the name of Martha, what's the difference between that and not saying anything? As long as you can keep up with my speed?" "I can't." "Then I won't discuss this with you. Next time I'll bring Mr. Tarkus. Deal." Insursta decisively betrayed his colleague. Tarkus, who was far away in the Pirate's Cove, sneezed a few times, but the latter rubbed his nose and looked up expressionlessly, completely ignoring someone's scheme. He was used to it anyway. Insursta then looked around at the surrounding shanty area, and replied to Brando, "It seems that the people of the Phantom Chariot have sealed off the harbor. This means that they have been prepared, Mr. Earl." "You think so too?" Brando asked. "They obviously don't trust that Lord Rosaline as much as you think. Judging from their cooperation, that's indeed the case. Even if they didn't expect that Lord Rosaline would betray them at the last minute, they probably calculated that he and his lousy knight wouldn't be able to stop you. It's easy for you to get something out of those people. They're obviously not tough guys." Brando thought for a while, and felt that there was nothing wrong with Insursta's analysis. He nodded and said, "They already expected us to come to the harbor? I can only say that it's fortunate that we didn't use that secret passage. I think that Lord Rosaline's so-called secret passage is only a secret from his knight subordinates. Poor guy." Insursta commented while shaking his head. "Then they sealed off the harbor area, and even the people inside are not allowed to come out. Are they afraid that we will know what's going on inside? Brando asked again. That's possible, but I think it's a little too much. They might be doing this to cover up something. There are many eyes in the harbor area. But what kind of thing must be done in an open area? A ritual. Brando immediately understood. It seems that they have already prepared a trap. I think so too. Do you have a way to deal with it? Insursta asked. He actually wanted to say that if Brendel wasn't completely confident, then he should leave Oderfeis and Halrangaya to him for safekeeping. However, his words changed in the end. If you're not confident, why don't we let Tarkus sail the ship outside the harbor and launch an attack from the outer harbor? That won't be necessary. Brando shook his head in disdain. Leave this little trick to me. Chapter 1242. Insursta suddenly felt a shudder pass through his body. The feeling scared him so much that he almost jumped up from the ground. He saw an invisible ripple spreading out in all directions with Brando as the center. It was like a drop of water falling on the surface of the water, creating a circle of ripples. However, between the peaks and troughs of the ripple, there were flashing silver threads of the law. This net-like structure swept across all the huts near and far. It felt as if the huts had turned into a net-like structure for a moment, only to return to their original state in an instant. The future Black Lord of Madara was a little stunned as he looked at the scene. The will has taken form. He then shouted again. How far do you plan to spread this thing? Insursta quickly bared his teeth because he had seen the layout of the port before. According to the speed of the ripple's spread, it had probably swept across half of the port by now. He wanted to remind Brando that there might be supreme-class existences among them, and it was unlikely that they would not notice such a spying, but it was a little too late now. At this time he kept his mouth shut because he believed that Brando was not a reckless person. If a guy with a brain full of muscles could force him and Tarkus to such a state, they might as well find a piece of tofu and kill themselves. Brando did not move. Just as the Insursta dragon had expected, the domain weaved by his lines of law quickly covered most of the harbor. He had thought of this method less than an hour ago when he used his dark perception to eavesdrop on the conversation between the other party and Tarkus. He just integrated it into his own extreme planes. Now it seemed that the effect was better than he imagined. Within a radius of a few miles, everything seemed to be included in his perception. He had never experienced such a feeling before. The conversations and whispers of hundreds of people here were as if they were in his ears. It should have been very noisy, but in his perception it was very clear. It was as if he could extract a voice or a conversation with just a thought. This was definitely not something that could be done by humans. Brando himself was shocked. His original intention was to explore what the hell was in the port, but he did not expect this feeling to make him feel like an omniscient and omnipotent god. In fact, he was very familiar with this ability to filter and search the content of the conversation. Wasn't this the remote chat system in the Amber Sword? He now had a feeling that he had forced his way into a regional chat channel, and it was a private channel, and he had quietly gained administrator authority. Brando almost instantly understood that this was definitely his strange system helping him. With just a thought, he could monitor almost all the conversations related to himself in this area. In fact, he had heard several conversations mentioning the outsider, Huang Hua and Mr. Liu. The outsider was obviously himself. He was about to continue listening, but he found that his vision seemed to be stretched, and he suddenly saw the scene in the port area. He saw several guys wearing black fire patterns and loose robes with long sleeves gathered in 2s and 3s. Several people who were obviously the leaders were commanding them to surround a warehouse. In the open space outside the warehouse, some other people were drawing a huge magic circle. There seemed to be something in the center of the magic circle, but an unfamiliar law blocked his observation, making him unable to get close. He turned his gaze and saw that there were 3 people around the spirit array who were raising their heads. 2 of them stood next to the magic circle, and the other person was in an inconspicuous corner of the crowd. Luin immediately understood what was going on. Sure enough, there were 3 Lemeters or some who were half a step into the Lemeters. He was not too surprised that he was detected by the other party. If the Supreme Class Masters did not even know that they were being spied on, then they did not live up to their name. After reaching the Supreme Class, one's own law would automatically form a domain around the body. Often, once spied on in any form, it would automatically react, either counterattack or remind oneself, depending on the nature of the element. In Wound, this ability was called the Law Barrier. It was actually an upgraded version of the Will Barrier. In 9 Phoenix, it was called Heavenly Perception. Brando almost immediately felt 3 counterattacks stabbing in his direction. 2 of these counterattacks came from the spiritual world, and 1 from the elemental world. He secretly cursed. These supreme class masters of the Ghost Chariot were too extreme. They did not even have a single defensive element, and they were all so irritable. In the past, he would not have been able to do anything about these counterattacks and could only take them head-on. However, in that way, the other party would obviously be able to detect his presence. However, ever since he asked about the mystery of the Heavenly Eye of Phoenix Fire, all of this was no longer a problem. The Heavenly Eye of the Jade Phoenix clan came from the interaction between humans and nature. Of course, this was what the 9 Phoenix said. The people of Wound liked to call the law the Heavenly Way, which was also the way of nature. The 9 Phoenix sword emphasized the way of the unity of man and nature. Of course, Wound also had the same concept when he was in the later stages of the Saint Domain and had a perfect body. However, the people of Wound preferred to talk about this in terms of laws and elements. The actual function of the Heavenly Eye was to control one's surrounding law. However, it was not only to control the law lines around one's body, but also to use one's own law to invade the other party's territory. From there, one could learn some information about the other party and their movements. Unlike Vaunt, who regarded the extreme planes as his own domain or territory, the 9 Phoenixes paid more attention to the offensive nature of the extreme planes. When Marshal Blank used the mirror still water of the White Raven Sword technique to force him to withdraw the lines of law, and then took the initiative to attack, it was actually a method of application influenced by this 9 Phoenix's ideology. Therefore, at that time he was flustered. Rather than saying that he was inexperienced, it was more accurate to say that he had never encountered such a fighting style before. It was inevitable that he found it difficult to deal with. The 9 Phoenix people's way of using the law was not unique to the Jade Phoenix clan. In fact, he had already formed a widespread recognition, just like how the people of Wound recognized their own fighting style. However, the Jade Phoenix clan's Heavenly Eye went further on this path, and their control of the law lines was also more refined. This ability was not a big secret to the 9 Phoenix royal family. In fact, several sword factions that had a good relationship with the Jade Phoenix clan had more or less learned the mystery of the Heavenly Eye. Even within the Ghost Chariot, the Heavenly Eye was not a big secret. Therefore, when Brando asked, Phoenix Wu did not hesitate and told him everything. After understanding how this ability was used, it was too easy for Brando to replicate it with his strength. In fact, it was not only that. He realized that the 9 Phoenix people's way of thinking was quite compatible with his own law and element. When the space-time element was used with this idea, it might be able to produce unexpected results, just like what he was doing now. He did not care about the 3 Supreme Class elites probing. Instead, he directly used his ability to invade the law network in the port area. He used the space-time element to trace back time and directly wiped out the existence of his own law lines. At that moment, the 3 Supreme Class elites of the Ghost Chariot were stunned. They raised their heads and looked about them with a puzzled expression. Just a moment ago, they felt as if someone was spying on the situation in the port area through the law domain. They also tried to counterattack in that direction, but it was only for a moment, and that abrupt feeling disappeared. It was not because the other party had retracted the law lines, but it was as if they had never existed. They felt as if their previous perception was an illusion. In fact, after they spread out their law domains, they received the same information. It really seemed to be an illusion. Meanwhile, in the shack area a few miles away, the Insursed Dragon was staring dumbfoundedly at a few lines of law sweeping across the void. They seemed to be aimlessly shooting through the air. And then there was no more news. What elemental ability is this? He asked subconsciously. He had never heard that his nomological perception could be deceived and missed. Brando turned around and smiled at him. Of course it's something good. He was actually even more satisfied. There was nothing more real in this world than the law. For a supreme class elite, your law would never deceive you, and they would not be deceived by the law of others. But there was an exception. That was, the other party's prying had never existed. When he used the law of spacetime to trace back time, his prying was in the state of not happening to the other party's law. Since it had not happened, it obviously did not exist. So it was not a lie. Brando had been trying to figure out how to use the law after he learned about the 9 Phoenixes method. He had guessed a way to use it on the way here, but he did not expect that after experimenting the actual effect was much better than he had imagined. Everything before their eyes was proof of that. Seeing that Insursta still did not quite understand, he did not intend to explain. He only said to the other party, "I saw something in the port area." Insursta was stunned for a moment before he realized what Brando was talking about. He asked, "What is it?" "It's a magic circle, but that magic circle shouldn't be targeted at us. There's something inside that magic circle, and that magic circle seems to be prepared to protect that thing. Unfortunately, the law around that thing is of a higher level than mine, so I can't see what it is clearly. I can only vaguely see that it's a sword." "A sword?" Insursta asked. "That thing's law is of a higher level than yours, sir. I'm afraid that your law's level is not low either." Brando nodded. He was actually also thinking about this problem. The spacetime element was already at the level of existential power. In theory, there should not be any element of a higher level than the spacetime element. If there was no difference in quality, then only quantity was left. In other words, the other party's element level was existential at least, and the total amount was stronger than his own. What was that thing? The first thing he thought of was naturally the sacred sword, but then he shook his head. Because ever since he completed the trial of the majestic mountain at the elemental barrier, he had a faint connection with the sacred swords, and that sword obviously did not give him such a feeling. Of course, he could not rule out the possibility that it was isolated by that magic circle. "In any case," Brando replied, "we'll know when we see it. P.S. The news about the audit has been spreading like wildfire recently. Amber doesn't seem to have received the notice yet, but I'm full of integrity. It seems that I won't die if I don't actively seek death. For the next book, I've decided to write a female protagonist. This way I won't even have to give the protagonist a cheat. As long as the enemy attacks a position other than the protagonist's hand, it will be neutralized. Thinking about it this way, I'm still a genius after all." Chapter 1243. Inside warehouse number 14, Mr. Liu was holding his sword with one hand and sitting on a few wooden boxes. His right hand was wrapped in a white cloth that was speckled with dark red spots. He used the cloth to wrap his hand and the sword hilt together. Not far from him, a few corpses dressed in ghost chariot costumes were crawling in front of the door. Since then no one dared to break in. But he knew in his heart that the other party was only afraid of the ancient phoenix jade pendant in his hands. Not to mention that the 3 elders of Ghost Chariot were outside. As long as they completed the ritual of worshipping the sacred jade sword, he would be doomed. The people of Ghost Chariot even summoned the sacred jade sword. Then presumably Feng Qi should also be nearby. Mr. Liu's heart sank. It was just as the young man from Wone said. The other party must have been preparing here for a long time. The news must have been leaked when they turned from Madara. Even if there was no starfall, he and Huanghua would have been caught by the other party in Madara. He was careless. I only hope that the young man can protect Mississippi, he thought to himself. Once again, he stood up from the wooden box with the sword in his hand. The aura of the sacred jade sword outside was becoming more and more obvious. Even if he was in the warehouse, he could faintly feel the faint sound of a dragon's roar coming from outside. He was ready to sacrifice himself, but the people of Ghost Chariot outside were still biding their time. The third elder raised his snow-white eyebrows and retracted his gaze from the sky. The previous flash of vigilance made him feel vaguely uneasy, but even so, he still chose to believe in his domain of law. A person's habits accumulated over hundreds of years were very scary. As long as one was not an obsessive-compulsive disorder patient, a normal person would not repeatedly check whether they had locked the door or not. Besides, the 3 elders of Ghost Chariot were separated. Otherwise, they might have discovered that the 3 of them had an illusion at the same time, and would probably be more vigilant. Third elder was not in a hurry to attack the warehouse. Lu Wu would not be able to escape anyway. Mr. Liu was ranked 5th in the Liu family in this generation. Those who respected him called him Mr. Liu, but his enemies would not call him that. Third elder was very clear about this person's bad temper. He knew that the other party would not surrender. He did not plan to let his subordinates go in and be the scapegoat for the other party. The ancient phoenix jade pendant was an ancient sacred object. It was one of the few objects left behind from the legendary Eastern dynasty. Just like Wu's history, the history of the Nine Phoenix had been destroyed several times. The Nine Phoenix dynasty was also built on the ruins of the previous civilization, including the White Raven, Desert Wind, and the Three Great Swords, and even the Nine Phoenix's most mysterious legendary jadeite riddle. They were all relics of the previous era. The ancient phoenix jade pendant, which also came from that era, was extremely powerful. If that person did not hesitate to sacrifice himself to summon the ancient phoenix spirit, it was not impossible to burn Luo Celine to the ground. It was a pity that the other party was wary of the young lady of the Jade Phoenix clan who was still in the city. Otherwise, this battle would not have been so easy. He turned around and saw a green jade sword taking shape in the center of a purple magic array on the plaza at the dock. He immediately calmed down and turned around to shout into the warehouse. Lu Bai, in the past, Ghost Chariot and Jade Phoenix were of the same bloodline. They fought because of differences in ideology. Now that we are in danger, there is hope for the revival of our Ghost Chariot bloodline. Why not persuade the Jade Phoenix bloodline to summon the heart of the Azure Dragon with us and restore the glory of the Nine Phoenix dynasty for thousands of years? The third elder was full of energy. His voice echoed in the air above the harbor for a long time. Unfortunately, the warehouse was silent and there was no response. This damned diehard. Although he already knew the result, he could not help but stare at him and curse in his heart. Since you want to die, I will fulfill your wish. He turned around in exasperation and bowed to the summoning magic array. He shouted, "Holy Sword, please descend." At the same time, two other voices resounded from different locations of the square. A dazzling cyan light descended from the sky. Falling vertically from the sky, it steadily landed on the illusory image of the sacred jade sword in the center of the formation. The crowd in the plaza suddenly exclaimed. Even the third elder could not help but raise his eyebrows. The Jade Dragon Holy Sword was also a relic of the previous dynasty. In the era when Ghost Chariot was still in charge of the Nine Phoenix, this sword was once the symbol of the entire Nine Phoenix. In that era, even in the War of the Dynasty, the Ghost Chariot family rarely used this sacred object. To be able to see the Holy Sword once in his life, even if it was just a fractal, he was extremely excited. The Holy Sword had awakened from its slumber. His generation could finally see the revival of the Ghost Chariot bloodline. Just as the third elder and the Ghost Chariot people in the plaza were extremely excited. In the forest not far away from Rosaline's castle, Delphian was also staring at this green light. This light column was reflected in her light purple eyes for a long time, making her gaze seem somewhat deep. Feng Qi stood beside her with a smile and said, "How is it, Miss Delphian? I heard that the people of Wond have a sacred object called the Azure Lance. It was the lance of the Azure Knight who opened up the mortal era. The Nine Phoenix also has the same history. The Jade Dragon Holy Sword was the pioneer of the era before the Nine Phoenix. It has a similar legend with the heart of the Azure Dragon. In our history, the owner of the Jade Dragon Holy Sword is the king of the Nine Phoenix." Seeing that Delphian was staring blankly in that direction without replying, he scratched his head in distress and said, "Well, Miss Delphian, did you hear what I said?" Only then did Delphine come back to her senses. The azure light indeed reminded her of something. However, the light column that descended from the sky reminded her of the dazzling light that she saw that night in the loop of trade winds. In the darkness of that civilization, a solitary beam swayed in the wind and rain. It was as if time had turned back thousands of years, and the bonfire that the ancestors had lit in the wilderness, unyieldingly announcing the birth of the empire. The history of the mortals had never been smooth sailing. The ancient kings had walked through thorns, and the path that they opened up with sword and fire in the ignorance was definitely not a bright and smooth path now. She glanced at Feng Qi and replied indifferently, "How ambitious are you?" Feng Qi's expression turned solemn. He looked at the light with some yearning and muttered, "Very ambitious, Miss Delphian. I believe that I belong to this era. My heart can accommodate this vast world. How about it, are you willing to be with me?" "Ha ha," Delphian smiled slightly. "You are far inferior to him. Who? You will know in a while. The Prime Minister's daughter replied softly, as if she was talking about a guessing game. The moment the azure light rose, Brendel felt the vibrations of the elements of nature and wind in his body. This was unique. The laws of the elemental orb and the holy sword had always been in a stable state in his body, and he could not detect them at all. The only time he had such a feeling before was when he was inside the elemental barrier. When the talent of the chosen one that Martha gave him appeared, all the elements resonated with him. But the rising light column also gave him a sense of familiarity. The feeling was exactly the same as when he first felt the holy lance of heaven. Brando could not help but be shocked. He immediately realized that the thing in the magic circle was a sacred object that was not inferior to the azure lance. Although he already knew that the azure lance was not the only sacred object in the world when he was inside the elemental barrier, it was the amber sword that belonged to the era of the Azure Knight. Then, before or even after that, there must be something similar on the earth, but he did not expect to encounter it in this place so soon. It was a sacred object of nature and wind, and it existed in the form of a sword. Brando immediately understood. He knew that the azure lance was also a sacred object of the wind, and was the owner of the power of the earth and wind. If this sword existed before the azure lance, then its power of wind should no longer exist, but it was very likely that it still had the power of nature left. Especially when he already knew that the heart of the azure dragon was the orb of nature, and it was likely to be near the nine-headed phoenix. He just did not know if the power contained in this sword came from the verdant sword. But no matter what, Brendel's interest was piqued as soon as the item appeared. He did not even dream that there would be such a pleasant surprise. He could not help but wonder if he had used up all his luck for the next few decades. He clearly remembered that back in the game, he and Senior Baijia were known as the twin demons of the dark wind. Not to mention the additional drops, even the fixed loot would often be bugged by Senior Baijia, causing her to lose everything. Thinking of this, he could not help but prepare to attack, but before that, he looked back at Insursta and reminded him, "Mr. Insursta, you're not thinking of taking the opportunity to escape, are you? Count, you're insulting my character. You're an undead. Undead have personalities too." Brando nodded and signaled with his eyes that this guy better not run around. Although it was difficult to escape from Rosaline in such a short time, he did not want to cause trouble for himself. Then he activated the spatial element and disappeared in front of Insursta in a flash. The next thing he knew, he had already appeared in the port 1,000 meters away. However, he still did not choose to take off, but went around the back of the square through the intricate roads between the warehouse areas. Previously, he had scanned the entire port, and in addition, he knew the layout of the port like the back of his hand, so it was easy to not alarm the three elders of the Phantom Chariot. Moreover, at this moment, almost everyone in the Phantom Chariot was attracted by the descent of the Holy Sword. When Brando arrived at the square, no one noticed that there was an extra person between them. Chapter 1244. Brando did not expose them. He stood silently in the crowd and looked up at the beam of green light. At the same time, his eyes were trying to determine the original position of the three elders. But it was at this moment that a sudden high-pitched dragon roar resounded through the sky, attracting everyone's attention. Brando was no exception. In his stunned gaze, he saw an eastern dragon that he had often seen in historical myths in his previous life, rising from the misty green light. The dragon was several hundred meters long. It slowly emerged from the green light pillar and spiraled upwards. Although it could be seen that it was only a shadow in an energy state, its hair and beard were all fluttering. It was so vivid that no one would think that it was just an illusion. What's more, before Brendel even got close, he could already feel the immense pressure from the terrifying magic ripples emanating from the other party's huge body. That pressure clearly did not come from the phantom, but from its main body in the magic formation below, which was the sword itself. Brando was secretly shocked. This was definitely a sacred object that was no less than the azure lance, and this holy sword seemed to be completely unsealed, almost the same as it was in its heyday. The only difference was that it did not have the fate blessing from the amber sword. It was a completely different concept from the holy lance in Scarlet's hand that had just been unsealed. But the mountain girl obviously did not have the ability to master such a powerful weapon. This was definitely the power of existence. The pressure made Brando's hair stand on end. He was a little surprised that there was someone among the mortals in the present world who could control such power. But he only took a glance at the center of the square and understood. No one was controlling the holy sword. The reason it could be activated was because of the magic circle. He had never heard of the way the 9 phoenixes used a sacred object. It seemed that although the other party paid attention to swordsmanship, he obviously had his own unique views on magic. At least this magic circle was something that he had seen in Wond. Even in the literature of the Bugas, the craftsmen mages, there was nothing similar. Interesting. Brando thought to himself. If someone could master this sword, he would definitely turn around and leave. Although Mr. Liu was still trapped in the warehouse, he obviously had to act according to his ability to save people. The power of this sword at this moment was not inferior to that of the sage. If someone could master it, they would have to at least have a perfect body. Such an existence, not to mention now, even in his heyday in the Amber Sword, he might not be a match for the other party. It was almost equivalent to fighting the Azure Knight head-on. Brando did not think he had any chance of winning. Not to mention him, even the strongest players among the players would probably be sent to their deaths. But it was different now. The Holy Sword was an ownerless object in the magic circle. If he could get rid of the elders of the Phantom Chariot in the shortest time possible, then it would not be impossible to seize the sword. Brando's eyes quickly locked on the guy furthest away from the magic circle, but he did not immediately make a move. Instead, he waited for the right time. After all, the other party was a supreme class existence. Even if they were not as good as him, it was impossible for him to crush them one by one. If he was held back by any one of them, he would buy time for the others to summon the Holy Sword to attack him. That would be fun. Brando was waiting. Since the other party summoned the Holy Sword at this time, it was obvious that they were up to something. Mr. Liu was the only one in the warehouse. Brando did not think that the other party needed to let 3 supreme class masters use such a holy sword. It was a bit too outrageous to describe the current situation as using a sledgehammer to kill a chicken. So there was only one possibility, and that was that Mr. Liu also had something that these people were afraid of. The other party was waiting for the moment Mr. Liu summoned that thing. That would be the best opportunity for him to make a move. Brando was not wrong. In fact, he did not have to wait for too long. In almost a moment, he heard the same clear cry of a phoenix coming from the warehouse. Then he watched as a ball of fire burned out of the warehouse. Almost instantly, the roof of the warehouse turned into a sea of fire. A phoenix covered in green flames flew out of the sea of fire with a cry. The moment it flew out, it spread its wings that were originally closed. The green wings that were nearly 100 meters long immediately enveloped the entire harbor area. The buildings in the harbor, as well as the sailboats that were docked in the harbor, started to burn out of thin air. Even Brando, who was hundreds of meters away, felt a wave of heat hit him in the face. He could not help but curse in his heart. Although he did not know what the hell summoned this phoenix, the green flames on its body were not inferior to the power of the golden flames. It was also the highest level of fire elemental element. The top level fire elemental element was only second to the power of existence. Brando suddenly felt that the 9 phoenix was too abnormal. He had not been here for long, and he had already encountered such a top-level existence again and again. It was no wonder that the Amber Sword listed this place as one of the highest-level areas, and it was not open to ordinary players until the later stages of the game. However, he did not hesitate at all. Just as the blue phoenix flew towards the dragon in the air, he also sped towards his target at the first moment. How fast could he reach with the power of the Supreme Realm and the support of the spatial element when he activated the charge skill? Brando had never specifically calculated this question, and in fact this was the first time he used this combination of skills in the main material plane. That was the truth. Elder Ghostkar, who was half a step into the Supreme Realm, did not react at all. Since Brando chose him as the target, it was obvious that he was the weakest of the 3. And it was indeed so. Even the third elder, who was closest to the magic circle, reacted first, while the latter was still unaware of the danger. Be careful. When the third elder saw Brando, he was so scared that his heart almost stopped. What kind of speed was that? Even his eyes almost could not catch the other party's trace. However, when he shouted this warning, he already knew in his heart that he had actually made a wrong choice. This was because he realized that his warning had no effect at all. That person's speed had clearly surpassed the speed of sound in the air. He even saw a white cloud cone appear in front of the tip of Brando's sword that he pulled out. Brando's sword was extremely accurate. It was swordsmanship that was forged through decades of risking life and death. It could be said that there was no warrior in the world who was more desperate than the players. They were not even indifferent to life and death, but despised it. Life and death were just a piece of data to them, so almost no one knew how to fight for their lives better than the players. In this life, after stepping into the elemental realm and completely dispelling the fear of death, Brando completely inherited the gift from the other soul in his body. He even went one step further. His sword was like a gleaming razor. Under the elder's astonished gaze, his sword slashed across his neck, taking away a large head. On the other hand, his opponent's subconscious attack had only left a deep cut on his chest. Brando did not dodge or evade, because he did not want to give the elder any chance. The elder's attack was also from the supreme realm, but in fact it could only break through his defense. The terrifying defense of the Templar Knight was evident. On the contrary, the damage rebound from the blood of the scorching sun left a few deep wounds on the elder's body. It only took a moment. The elder's corpse had already fallen to the ground, blood spurting out like arrows. Almost everyone in the square was stunned. In the warehouse, Mr. Liu, who had burned almost half of his life force to summon the ancient Phoenix Jade amulet, his originally black hair had turned white. He was about to draw his sword and fight to his death, but he was also stunned. His strength was even weaker than the third elder of the Ghost Chariot outside. Although he was slightly better than the ordinary Ghost Chariot sect members outside, in fact, he only had time to see the seventh elder of the Ghost Chariot turn around. As for how Brando appeared, he realized that he had no idea at all. It was as if he had appeared out of thin air. He saw Brando withdraw his sword, and the seventh elder of the Ghost Chariot fell to the ground. Then, as soon as his feet touched the ground, he turned around and killed another elder of the Ghost Chariot not far away. Oh no! Mr. Liu was shocked. Be careful, Mr. Brando. Seeing this scene, he wanted to warn him, but he made the same mistake as the third elder. Because in a battle at their level, sound might not be faster than one's own speed. This was why in the supreme realm of Wond, even the warriors often knew a little bit of magic. Because at this level of cooperation, only magic was more reliable. In fact, as soon as Brando turned around, he already felt that something was wrong. Because the moment Elder Ghost Chariot fell to the ground, he immediately turned into a headless puppet. Substitute mysterious item. Brando was shocked. Although there were also things like Cypher's heart and Angel's heart vase in Wond, these things were extremely rare, and not just any Supreme Realm Master could have them. He was really shocked by the wealth of the people of Nine Phoenix. If this guy was the only one with a substitute strange item, he would just consider himself unlucky to have chosen the wrong opponent to attack first. But if all three of them had the same thing, he was afraid that this trip would be a little dangerous. Just as Brando was hesitating, he heard Mr. Liu's warning from behind. Mr. Liu obviously would not speak without thinking, so he immediately confirmed his guess. It seemed that these three Ghost Chariot elders all had substitute strange items. Brendel immediately cursed inwardly. What the hell is this Nine Phoenix? Even the substitute oddities have become cabbages in the ground? Chapter 1245. The Ghost Chariot did not enter the Nine Phoenix, and the Nine Phoenix did not leave the Cloud Ridge. The Cloud Ridge was the Green Jade Hill. For many years, the Ghost Chariot had treated the Swift Plains as its base. It had infiltrated the Nine Phoenix's forces like a sieve. More than a century ago, the Ghost Chariot's leader had ambushed and killed the Tiger Claw Grand Swordmaster on the Pipa Plateau. After that, it caused a bloody war that lasted for more than 20 years. To this day, the Ghost Chariot and the Tiger Claw sect were still feuding families. Their hatred for each other even exceeded the hatred between the Jade Phoenix and the Ghost Chariot. After that, the Eight Sword sect had a tradition of Grand Swordmasters not leaving the country. This was actually because of the vigilance brought by this incident. Although the Grand Swordmasters were powerful, it was also difficult for them to fight against schemes and plots. Moreover, the Ghost Chariot's forces were deeply rooted on both sides of the Tau Strait. The two sides seemed to have formed a tacit understanding. For the next half a century, the ghost chariot had become used to controlling everything on the swift plains. In addition, the Nine Phoenixes' forces had weakened in recent years, and it was gradually becoming more powerful. The people in the ghost chariot gradually became arrogant. If not for this, they would not have targeted the patrolling empress. If it was 30 years ago, the slightly conservative ghost chariot would definitely not have thought of contacting the Roman Tuo's Black Rose. Therefore, the more backward they were, the more conservative they were. This was an irrefutable truth. However, the third elder did not expect that just like 7 or 8 years ago, the plan that was almost certain to deal a heavy blow to the Nine Phoenix Kingdom, and even cause the Jade Phoenix clan to be unable to recover from this setback, had an accident at the last minute. There was actually someone who dared to interfere with the ghost chariot's matters on both sides of the Tawu Strait. The first thought in his mind was anger. This anger came without any reason. So what if it was a Grand Swordmaster? It was not like the ghost chariot had not dealt with such people before. The Tiger Claw Grand Swordmaster's fate back then was a clear proof. At that time, the Nine Phoenix could not do anything to the Swift Plains. Otherwise, its influence on the Tawu Strait would not have declined so much. He did not know about Phoenix Fire's promise to Lord Rosaline. Otherwise, he would have mocked her in his heart. The Nine Phoenix royal family only dared to make such a promise now. If it was 150 years ago, they only needed to say that they would protect Rosaline, and the Rosaline family would not do anything. What enemies and monsters could do to them? The current Nine Phoenix was no longer the Nine Phoenix of the past, and the current ghost chariot was no longer the loser who had lost his soul. What a fool! What are you still standing there for? Hurry up and surround him! The third elder roared. Ghost chariot's people, who were still shocked by Brando's soul-stirring sword, and the amazing scene in the sky, finally reacted. They came back to their senses, drew their long swords and surrounded him. Originally, there were 40 to 50 people in the square. More than half of them were above the gold level, and the rest had stepped into the elemental realm. Ghost Chariot and the Jade Phoenix were of the same lineage, and some of their ancient traditions had been passed down since the founding of the Nine Phoenix Empire. They were similar. After Ghost Chariot was defeated and left the Nine Phoenix Empire, he did not leave these traditions behind. This included the tradition of letting the elites of the Nine Phoenix Empire travel and gain experience, just like the Nine Phoenix Empire's tour. Therefore, these elites who had been traveling and gaining experience on the Swift Plains all year round were far more experienced than the old knight like Rosaline. Even if they were both at the gold level, their quality was not on the same level. These people were stunned, but once they came back to their senses, they almost immediately chose the most correct strategy. Stop him! Be careful, this person is very fast. Let's surround him and don't give him any space to display his skills. Those of the celestial realm, form a sword array with me, and disturb his mind from behind. Previously, Brando had beheaded the seventh elder with one sword. Although it was inevitable that it was a sneak attack and luck, it was enough to let these people understand the gap between them and Brando. They knew in their hearts that the threat they posed to Brando could be said to be negligible, but there were still 3 other supreme-level elders present. In a situation where it was 3 against 1, no matter how strong Brando was, it would be inevitable for him to be overwhelmed, right? In a battle between elites, victory and defeat was often decided by a thin line, so they did not need to affect Brando too much. They only needed to distract Brando slightly. These people did not think that Brando could fight 1 against 3, but they could see that Brando's abilities were at least above the 7th Elder and the 11th Elder. He was probably on par with the 3rd Elder, who was the strongest present, so they did not hope to determine the outcome of the battle. At least, it was enough to prevent the 7th Elder and the 11th Elder from being injured, especially since the 7th Elder did not have a second substitute rare item. Naturally, Ghost Chariot did not have 70 or 80 elders to die on the battlefield. These thoughts were formed in an instant, but they were definitely not spontaneous. In the entire Nine Phoenix, in terms of experience in dealing with great sword saints, if Ghost Chariot claimed to be second, no one would dare to claim to be first. After all, although Ghost Chariot had one of the 3 supreme swords, Nine Phoenix also had Jade Phoenix and White Raven, not to mention the other 6 swords supporting the royal family. Although Nine Phoenix was in decline now, and Ghost Chariot itself was showing signs of resurgence, compared to the 8 supreme sword sects, it would never think that the absolute number of great sword saints could surpass the Nine Phoenix Kingdom. Therefore, since a long time ago, Ghost Chariot had been studying how to deal with this absolute gap in strength. The plan to ambush and kill the great sword saint of the Tiger Claw sect a century ago could be said to be to seize the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to weaken the strength of the Nine Phoenix Kingdom. It was also a rehearsal of this long-term strategy. Now the experience from 150 years ago, after fermenting over time, had come true on Brando. The latter had originally planned to end the battle quickly, but he did not expect that the other party would have something similar to Cypher's heart. This was really a huge trap, and it completely ruined his original plan, forcing him to face such a fact. That meant he had to face a head-on battle, and he had to face the threat of the Jade Imperial Sacred Sword at all times. Plans really can't keep up with changes. Facing the Ghost Chariot gang that surrounded him, Brando actually had the mood to mock himself in his heart. Mr. Liu, who was rushing out of the warehouse, saw this scene and secretly cursed. If he could, he would rather Brando take the young lady and run away. Although in his opinion Brando might be a rare master, it was a little whimsical to think that he could fight against 3 Supreme Realm Masters alone. 100 years ago, the great sword saint of the Tiger Claw sect was also a master at that time. What happened to the latter? What's more, he saw the people on the field clearly. Except for the guards close to the Golden Circle, the rest of the people were all masters. Some of them were even stronger than him. It could be seen that the Ghost Chariot gang's arrangement in Rosaline was very thorough. They were determined to keep him and the young lady here. He secretly hated Madara's undead for meddling in the affairs of the Nine Phoenix. At the same time, he made up his mind. Even if the spirit of the ancient phoenix was hit by the Jade Imperial Sacred Sword, he would let it attack the Ghost Chariot gang at the port below. At least he would create a chance for Brando to kill his way out. He had seen the speed of the other party's sword earlier. He believed that if they just wanted to escape, these people should not be able to stop the young man. The only chance now is to let this person take the young lady and escape. Although the hope is slim, at least it's better than waiting for death. He silently calculated in his heart. But as Brando said, plans could not keep up with changes. Just as Mr. Liu made up his mind, there were unexpected changes on the scene. Everyone from the Ghost Chariot gang surrounded him confidently. They thought that the battle from 1.5 centuries ago would reappear today. After all, even if the young man in front of them was at the level of a Grand Sword Saint, he could not be compared to the Tiger Claw Grand Sword Saint who was over 50 years old at his peak, right? What's more, at that time the Ghost Chariot gang only sent out 2 Supreme Masters. Now there were 2 here, and the Jade Imperial Sacred Sword was in the air. But before the 3 elders had time to make a move, Brando had already made his move. He did not draw his sword. In fact, it was impossible to kill all these people at once even if he drew his sword. Whether it was the 9 Luminary Sword Art or Flash Strike Sword Art, they were all in the category of swordsmanship. There were still 3 elders from the Ghost Chariot gang staring at him. Brando was not arrogant enough to think that he could fight against 3 of them at once. On the contrary, he used a more direct way. Using force to oppress people, Brando suddenly stopped. He did not even look at the puppet that had fallen to the ground behind him. It was as if he did not care whether the 7th elder, who had been cut down by his sword, was dead or alive. He only held his sword and looked back. His serious gaze swept across the port square. A layer of fine and dense net-like silver brilliance appeared in the space, causing everyone's momentum to stagnate. The power of a Lammeter surged out like a tidal wave, and the 3 elders were shocked. They had never dreamed that a junior would dare to use the extreme planes in front of them, and in such an unreasonable manner. It was almost as if he didn't have any defensive measures in place. This feeling was exactly the same as when Brando dealt with him. Even if the 3 elders from the Ghost Chariot gang were from the 9 Phoenixes, they still caught Brando off guard. Then they exploded with anger. Especially the 3rd elder. In his opinion, this young man was simply provoking them. Although it was common knowledge that the 9 Phoenixes used the power of precepts to take the initiative to attack, it also depended on who was facing whom. If a guy whose elemental level and absolute strength were weaker than his opponent took the initiative to use the power of precepts to attack the opponent, what was this if not courting death? At least in the eyes of the 3 elders, Brando was courting death. Not to mention that Brando's young age made the 3rd elder look down on him. In his opinion, even if the opponent's strength might be in the realm of a great sword saint, or even surpass the 7th and 11th elder, it was not enough in front of him. Chapter 1246. After all, one's strength was related to one's age. Even if Brando was the chosen one and had been practicing the sword since he was in his mother's womb, how much strength could he have? The genius of the ghost chariot, Feng Qi, was known as a once-in-a-millennium genius, but at his age, he was far from being a match for these elders. Not to mention that he was fighting 1 against 3. Therefore, Brando's action was a naked mockery. Not only was it completely out of their expectations, but they also knew very well that no matter what Brando was going to do next, at least their subordinates were going to be in big trouble. This was all because of their negligence. How could the 3 elders not be angry? Therefore, they opened up their extreme planes almost immediately. They wanted to save as many people as possible before Brando's extreme planes enveloped the ghost chariot troop around him. At the same time, they completely opened up their strength, planning to teach this arrogant young man a painful lesson. At this time, even the 7th elder, who had been heavily injured by Brando and had used a substitute artifact to escape the disaster, could not help but jump out again. Together with his 2 companions, he opened up his extreme planes that had not been fully formed. Brendel turned around abruptly and met the man's ferocious gaze. If one time is not enough, then let's do it again. You don't know the immensity of heaven and earth. The 7th elder's face turned green and white. Although it was true that he had been ambushed, it was also true that as a supreme class expert, he had no room to fight back. Unlike the 3rd elder of the ghost chariot, he only thought that the opponent's method was despicable and the speed was strange. He was caught off guard and did not realize that it was because he was not strong enough. After all, it took some courage to admit that one's strength was not as strong as others. Moreover, he was in existence with an extremely high status in the ghost chariot and had long been used to his high status. Pfft. Feng Qi raised his wrist and stared at the dark red crystal in his hand. He finally could not help but snort. He turned around and smiled at Delphian. "This is the guy you were talking about?" Delphian looked away from the dragon and phoenix entangled in the sky above Rosaline Harbor. Unlike Brando, she could not recognize the sacred beasts of the 9 phoenixes. But this did not stop her from knowing how terrifying these 2 monsters were. Even in this direction, she could feel the impact of the battle between the 2 sacred beasts. Not to mention that the harbor had already turned into a hellish scene. Even from far away, she could feel waves of scorching heat waves sweeping over. Such a scene made her involuntarily think of Rushta from that day. The most powerful force in the world once again made her feel powerless. The things she was proud of were not worth mentioning in front of these existences. This thought made her look at the man in front of her a little absent-minded, as if she was not listening to what he was saying at all. But that was just a facade. Delphian only stood still for a moment before asking, "What do you want to say?" "Nothing." Feng Qi was also used to her strange way of talking. He smiled proudly. "Your friend may be very strong, but he doesn't seem to have enough brains." "He is not my friend," Delphian corrected coldly. At the same time, she replied, "He is a little stupid, but it seems that you are not much better." "Is that so?" Feng Qi shook the red crystal on his wrist like a child. "This person actually dared to barge into the harbor knowing that my men were lying in ambush there. He probably thought that he was already invincible. Unfortunately, he didn't expect that I actually arranged 3 sacred swordmasters there. This time he kicked an iron plate." As he spoke, this guy actually laughed to himself, as if he had heard something very funny. 3 sacred swordmasters. He must be shocked. Delphian frowned as she looked at this guy. She felt that this guy looked calm and composed on one hand, but sometimes he acted like a child. "What is a sacred swordmaster?" she asked. Feng Qi replied, "According to what you said, it is the early stage of the supreme realm. The peak of the supreme realm is either under a saint or a celestial. It is not a level that ordinary people can come into contact with." When he said the second half of the sentence, there was a hint of yearning in his tone. But Delphian smiled at him after hearing this. Feng Qi was stunned. He looked at this woman and felt that her smile was a little strange. It was a fake smile. "What's wrong with you, Miss Delphian?" "Nothing," Delphian replied. "I have the same idea as you, Mr. Feng Qi. Someone might have kicked an iron plate. Is that so? After receiving Delphian's approval, the latter seemed a little happy, but he shook his head and said, Mr. Feng Qi, this name is too strange. According to our tradition here, you should call me Mr. Feng, but I prefer you to call me Feng Qi. Before he finished speaking, the sky suddenly flashed, as if there was a terrible explosion in the direction of Rosaline Harbor. Although there was no sound, a white light swept over from that direction. Feng Qi's words were stuck in his throat. He stared in that direction with his eyes wide open. After a vast white light, the entire Rosaline port disappeared. Looking in that direction from the headland, there was only a huge crater left where the Rosaline port used to be. The seawater quickly flowed in, forming a bright inner lake in the crater. Feng Qi was at a loss for words. What's going on? In fact, this was the question that the Ghost Chariot's third elder wanted to ask. Of course, all of this started a few minutes ago. When Brando opened up the extreme plane, he and his two companions did not hesitate to open up the extreme plane. After all, he originally thought that Brando attacked the seventh elder because he knew that his strength was not as good as the three of them combined, so he had no choice but to do so. Otherwise, if the other party had the strength, why would he need to launch a sneak attack? Wouldn't he be able to do it openly? But what he did not expect was that Brando just wanted to avoid trouble. Not to mention that the sacred jade sword was another concern. At that time, Brando's sneak attack could be said to have succeeded, and they wasted one of their substitution strange items. Substitution strange items were not as cheap as Brando imagined. The Ghost Chariot had the 13th elder, and only the first 5 people had substitution strange items bestowed by the saints. The 7th elder's substitution strange item was borrowed from someone for this mission to deal with the ancient Phoenix Jade amulet. Moreover, the substitution strange item was not as magical as imagined. Not to mention that it was an ancient relic, and there was one less substitution strange item. In fact, its substitution strange item overdrew the owner's life as the price. After this battle, the Ghost Chariot might lose an elder. But he thought that the other party was not without a price, because since the sneak attack did not succeed, then he would have to face their Thunder Fury next. But what he did not expect was that the Thunder Fury would come, but it was not theirs. When they opened up their extreme plane to collide with Brando, they found the problem. The 3 Ghost Chariot's Grand Elders realized at the same time that their Lemeter strength was far inferior to this young man's in terms of quality, and even the 3 of them combined were suppressed by him in terms of quantity. What did this mean? The Ghost Chariot's third elder looked up at Brando in shock. He already knew that the other party had the strength of a great sword saint, and he might be stronger than the 7th elder and the 11th elder. He was prepared for this. But how could the other party be so strong? 3 great sword saints. The Ghost Chariot's 3 grand elders. Even with their absolute power combined, they were still suppressed by a young man. Could it be that this world was no longer the world they were familiar with? Or was he dreaming and had not woken up yet? The third elder's mind was in a mess, and he could only think of this at the moment. He watched as the Ghost Chariot's Lemeter strength was fixed in space by Brando's Lemeter strength, and then the latter waved his hand, and these people were silently beheaded like broken puppets. The extreme plane of the third elder and the other 3 were all suppressed in a narrow area, and they could not move. He saw that even after those people's bodies were cut into pieces, they were still fixed in space and did not move at all. The dismembered body parts and blood seemed to be in a world where time was completely still, floating in the air. He only felt a bitter taste in his mouth, the elements of space and time. No matter how slow he was, at this moment he understood what Brando's elements were. However, the Ghost Chariot's third elder was still a Lemeter after all, and he was not completely stupid. Although almost all of his subordinates were wiped out, Brando's extreme plane was not enough to completely suppress the 3 of them. Don't fight him with the power of law. Let's fight him in close combat. 11th elder, don't care about Lu Bai. Go control the Jade Dragon's sacred sword. We'll buy time for you. As he roared, he pulled out a green jade sword and attacked in Brando's direction. The other 2 elders also reacted immediately. The 11th elder turned and ran, while the 7th elder, who had been seriously injured by Brando earlier, surrounded him from both sides. Brando was most worried about the Jade Dragon's sacred sword in the sky. so he naturally would not give them the chance to control the sacred sword. He immediately blocked the third elder's sword. Nine Phoenix's swordsmanship was very different from Wu's. The former was more agile and would rarely clash with the opponent's sword. On the other hand, Wu's swordsmanship was born from battle formation swordsmanship, and there was a lot of attention to the exchange of swords. Therefore, when the two swords clashed, both of them felt a little awkward. Brando was thinking about how the sword was so light that it did not have any force behind it. On the other hand, the third elder was cursing the barbarian in his heart. That sword almost broke his corundum sword. Although the jade sword in his hand looked very fragile, it was also a strange item that was close to the mythical level. It also came from an ancient inheritance, and in terms of hardness, it was not inferior to a steel longsword. However, the longsword in the opponent's hand, which was covered with golden cracks, was like a monster. Every time he clashed with the opponent, he could almost feel the longsword in his hand crying out in grief. With just one sword, the third elder was completely avoided by Brando. He could not help but turn pale with fright. This young man was not inferior to him in terms of absolute strength, but he did not expect that in terms of swordsmanship, he was also slightly better than him. Where did this monster come from? Although he was anxious, Brando was even more anxious. The square was not very big to begin with. When the 11th elder turned around, he had almost run to the side of the array that summoned the Jade Dragon's sacred sword. Although the ancient Phoenix and the Azure Dragon were fighting fiercely in the sky, Brando did not have the confidence to take a hit from the Jade Dragon's sacred sword. Chapter 1248. Seeing that the 11th elder was very close to the summoning circle of the Jade Dragon's sacred sword and placed his hand on the circle, he opened his mouth and chanted a few sentences in a language that Brando could not understand. He only felt that the words were rhythmic and powerful. However, Brando could faintly feel that the 11th elder's breath had suddenly connected with the Azure Dragon in mid-air. His heart sank as he looked at the 7th elder and the 3rd elder in front of him. Suddenly, he took out an item from the celestial sphere that was hanging in front of his chest. It was an ancient flute with 5 holes and a golden ring at the mouth. It was engraved with ivy and a goddess holding a water bottle. It was Hofward's horn of commendation, which he had obtained from the Termosian. He did not say a word and directly activated the flash strike sword art. Then he used the 9 luminaries sword art, one in front and one behind. The 2 figures pierced towards the 3rd elder and the 7th elder at lightning speed. The 2 were so shocked that their eyeballs almost popped out. No, it's not an illusion. Be careful. His attack ignores distance. The 3rd elder felt his hair stand on end. When did such a terrifying person appear in the rain-swallow plains? However, his heart was incomparably calm. The Iron Heart School emphasized that the heart was stronger than steel. As a master of the Iron Heart School, the closer he was to death, the calmer he would be. He changed from holding the sword with one hand to 2 and summoned the power of the Iron Heart in his heart. All the surprise, joy, shock, and jealousy from before disappeared without a trace. It was as if the person in front of him was no longer Brando but just a moving target. He continuously swung the sword in his hand, using the sword blade as a barrier to block the incoming sword. On the other side, Brando was performing the perfect flash strike sword art for the first time. He could clearly feel the harmony between man, sword, and space. The obvious feeling of breaking space had completely disappeared, and the sword in his hand was much faster than before. The shining sword blade had completely lost its trajectory. Everyone thought that the Flame King's flash strike sword art described his sword as fast as lightning. Once the sword light was released, it was like a flash of lightning. However, it was only at this moment that Brando understood that the essence of lightning was actually in the flash. It disappeared in a flash, as if it had never existed. In the blink of an eye, he had already traversed a distance of several dozen meters. He stabbed out 17 times with Odorfice, and the angle, direction, and strength of each attack were all different. Even the 9 luminaries sword art was pushed to the extreme by the flash strike sword art. The magic doppelgangers appeared continuously around the 3rd elder, like a continuous blurry shadow wall. But what surprised Brando even more was that under his storm-like attacks, the other party's sword veil didn't budge in the slightest. The clanging sounds of the 2 swords clashing rang out, and sparks splashed down like a waterfall of flames. 17 swords in a row, regardless of whether they came from the front, back, left, or right. The old man in front of him received them all with a cold expression. What surprised him even more was that when he exchanged blows with his opponent earlier, he could clearly feel that his opponent's strength was inferior to his own. But now, after exchanging blows with him consecutively, he could feel a new wave of energy surging out from his opponent's body after every exchange. He didn't recognize the 9 Phoenix's swordsmanship, but if Phoenix Flame was here, she would definitely tell him that this was one of the supreme mysteries of the Iron Heart School: iron focus and excellent parry. If the 9 Phoenix swordsmanship was included, the flash strike sword art was undoubtedly the #1 offensive swordsmanship in the world, and the 9 luminary sword art was known for its mysteriousness rather than its strong offensive power. In terms of defensive swordsmanship, the Iron Heart sword art should be crowned as the strongest. The locals of the 9 Phoenix swordsmanship called the Iron Heart School the Iron Fortress. Mr. Liu stood aside, but the latter couldn't see the confrontation between Brando and the third elder at all, let alone provide any help to the latter. Not to mention that after overdrawing his life to summon the ancient Phoenix Jade amulet, he was already half kneeling on the ground. The reason he didn't faint was purely because of his tenacious will. However, Brando didn't need any guidance from outsiders. He was a warrior. Things that couldn't be solved by swordsmanship could be solved by other means. Warriors relied on their keen intuition and instinct to win on the battlefield. Level, equipment, terrain, and even morale were all their means of fighting. Brando was no exception. When the flash strike sword art combined with the 9 luminary sword art didn't work, he directly rushed in and pointed his sword at the 7th elder's heart. He didn't care about the sword curtain in the 7th elder's hand. You want to trade injury for injury? The 3rd elder didn't even frown. The mutual destruction swordsmanship might be a threat to others, but it wasn't worth it to deal with the sword saint of the Iron Heart School. With a heart as cold as iron, he directly chose the most effective way to deal with it. He also pointed his sword at Brando's neck, as if he intended to die together with him. If Brando had a plan, then he really wanted to die. Under the state of mind of the Iron Heart School, swordsmen had already disregarded life and death. Of course, Brando wouldn't trade his life with this guy. He didn't even plan to activate the unyielding innate skill because the terrifying green jade sacred sword was still hanging upside down above his head. How could he dare to use his life-saving ability in such a situation? He tilted his head to the side and avoided his opponent's fatal sword. However, he had lost the initiative in the exchange of blows because he had moved first. The 3rd elder also easily avoided Brando's sword, and at the same time seized the opportunity to counterattack. He sneered and pointed his sword at Brando's shoulder. You can avoid the fatal sword, but you have to leave a memento. Otherwise, you can go back to where you came from. What he did not expect was that Brendel did not even try to dodge his attack. Instead, Brendel pounced straight at him, allowing his sword to cut into Brendel's left abdomen. A rose-colored mist of blood spurted out from the wound. Then the latter slammed into the 3rd elder's body, sending him flying several times. It seemed that he had gained a lot in this round of confrontation, but when the 3rd elder got up from the ground, he realized that he had made a mistake. The other party didn't want to trade injury for injury, but wanted to trade injury for an escape route. Unfortunately, he was fooled. He immediately heard an ear-piercing scream in his ears. He didn't need to look back to know that the 7th elder was also injured. The latter's strength was weaker than his, and he must have made a mistake in dealing with the previous sword because his heart wasn't as strong as steel. He raised his head and saw the 7th elder kneeling on the ground, clutching his shoulder. Brendel had already killed his way through the two of them, leaving a bloody path behind him. Brando had 2 serious injuries on his body. One was on the left side of his abdomen, and his black flannel windbreaker was soaked with blood. The other was on his cheek from his left forehead to his right eye. His eyes were tightly shut and fresh blood dripped down. In fact, he knew that the 7th elder's injury had nothing to do with the other party's strength. The other party probably didn't even dream that he would dare to exchange his sword with him face to face, and wasn't afraid of being beheaded. He was really bold. Of course, Brando wasn't bold. He was just confident in his own defense. Besides, he wanted to end the battle quickly. Once he succeeded, he didn't give the other party any time to react. He immediately jumped forward and passed through the 2 elders of the ghost chariot. At the same time, he raised the horn of commendation in his hand and poured the golden liquid into his mouth. As soon as the golden liquid entered his mouth, a cool feeling suddenly spread through his limbs and bones. The pain on his face and lower abdomen suddenly lessened, and the bleeding stopped immediately. Although the effect wasn't as terrifying as the angel's heart bottle, the performance of Howard's golden wine was much better than the number 2 holy water. However, Brando's eyes were wide open at this time, and he shouted in his heart. He naturally didn't forget that the golden wine had a strength bonus effect, but he didn't expect the strength bonus effect to come from this. When the wine entered his throat, Brando immediately felt his brain heat up. His vision suddenly tightened, as if he had the illusion that his muscles had swelled up. This feeling was very similar to the feeling he had when he activated the Undead Knight's crystal, but that was instantaneous while this was a continuous state. The next moment he felt as if his brain had been hit by a heavy hammer. It wasn't that he had been ambushed, or that he had been tricked by the Termosian. It was a state that couldn't be more primitive. He was drunk. Motherf asterisk cur. Brando couldn't wait to drag the Termosian out and beat him up. He didn't even tell him that the wine had side effects. And even if there were side effects, he didn't tell him that the side effects would be so great. Brando only felt that the world was spinning, and there was only one thought left in his mind, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. Damn, the aftereffect of this wine is so strong. He staggered forward. His strength was already far beyond that of a human after stepping into the elemental realm. In fact, the growth of the human body was already maximized after reaching the gold realm. After reaching the elemental realm, the increase in the power of the precepts was more. It was very difficult for the body's attributes to increase by several times, or even dozens of times like before. This could be seen from his own attribute panel. This situation would continue until he reached the perfect body realm. Only then would his body's attributes improve by leaps and bounds. However, it was still far from the leap from the white realm to the iron realm, and then from the iron realm to the silver realm and then to the gold realm. It could be said that in terms of growth and strength, from the stage of a mortal to the elemental realm, mortals were indeed one of the races with the most potential in the whole of Wond. And what did a 25% increase in overall strength mean? It meant that almost all the growth in strength from the elemental realm to the late stage of the precepts, or from the supreme realm to the perfect body realm. In other words, Brando's sip of wine was already at the peak of the sage realm in terms of strength. He didn't even realize it himself. He only felt dizzy, like a drunkard who loved wine as much as his life. He subconsciously took another sip of wine. Chapter 1249. After drinking the wine, Brando felt as if his whole body was on fire. When he stepped on the ground of the square, it was as if he was the ancient Greek hero, the half-human, half-god Hercules, who crushed half of the square. Borrowing this force, he rose up and shot forward like a cannonball. Under his feet, the square caved in by 5 or 6 meters with a rumble. The third elder was about to chase after him with a jade sword in his hand, but when he saw the stone slabs under Brando's feet flying out due to the collapse of the square, he could not help but turn pale. What the hell is this? The third elder, who had always been well-mannered, could not help but swear at this time. He then turned his sword around and knocked all the stone slabs away. After a round of sword dance, he found that his hands were trembling slightly. When he looked at the seventh elder, he was already buried under the rubble. Ah, damn it! Who can tell me where this bastard came from? Brando was completely unaware of the third elder, who had been left behind. To be honest, his mind was now in a mess. The aftereffect of the golden wine was so strong that it did not give him any time to react. What made him even more dumbfounded was that the Termosian people seemed to be used to this, and did not warn him in advance. Yes, the golden liquid collected by the Valkyrie from the wind and dew was a fine wine brewed for the brave souls. Since it was wine, how could it not have any side effects? The side effect was obviously intoxication. And this was the wine of the gods. Its power was needless to say. Brando was in such a state at the moment. His originally clear mind had completely disappeared, leaving only a beast-like instinct. This instinct allowed him to acutely sense the danger around him. He remembered that he only had one purpose before this. And that was to stop that damn guy from summoning that damn holy sword. The way he chose was simple and direct. With the help of the wine and the mark of fanaticism he opened. He even impatiently threw away the sword in his hand, which was in the way, and let the holy sword of fire shoot towards the third elder behind him like a stream of golden flames. The third elder, who could still fight Brando back and forth, was pierced in the abdomen by the sword before he could react. Fortunately, the sword had left his hand and did not carry any power of law. It was just pure physical damage. Otherwise, the unlucky elder Demoncar would have exploded and died. Even so, he clutched his stomach in pain and fell down. He closed his eyes and fainted. After the golden flame passed through him, it hit a wooden crane in the middle and cut it in half. It fell down with a loud crash, and then hit the burning bridge that extended into the bay behind it, splitting the sea apart. With a loud crash after Odorfeist turned into countless flame fragments and disappeared, the split sea surface fell down like two walls, forming countless white whirlpools on the surface of the sea. However, Brando did not even look at this scene. He only stared at the 11th elder, who was still sweating profusely as he knelt by the magic circle and muttered incantations. He held the golden horn with both hands and directly crashed into it. "You're dead." "Ah!" The 11th elder let out a blood-curdling scream. His entire body turned into a rain of blood and scattered all over the ground. A pitch-black straw figurine fell from the sky, but a moment later, the straw figurine also exploded with a paw sound. Its owner was clearly dead. However, Brando raised his head at this moment and looked at the two huge eyes in the sky. A terrifying pressure descended from the sky and pressed heavily on his body. Although the 11th elder was already dead, Brando could clearly see that in the shadow of the green dragon, the 11th elder's soul was clearly filled with anger. The 11th elder was holding the green jade sword and pointing it at his head. The 11th elder did not speak, and his eyes lacked the aura of a living person. It was like a remnant of his will, but it was enough to carry out his will when he was alive. Brendel, on the other hand, was not afraid at all. He felt as if his brain was about to burst into flames. As pure elemental creatures, the golden wine that the Termosi used to celebrate was not something that humans could enjoy, even if they were supreme class experts. His mind was noisy, as if countless heroes in Odin's golden palace were toasting and celebrating. His brain heated up. He raised the horn and gulped it down, almost drinking half of the golden wine in the horn. If there were any Termosi present, they would probably give Brando a thumbs up and say that he was worthy of being called a hero in wine. Unfortunately, Brando did not have the slightest awareness at this moment. After drinking half of the horn's golden wine, he had completely lost consciousness. However, the power in his body was burning fiercely. The increase of 125% of his strength had directly made his strength attribute break through the surface. It could be said that in terms of strength alone, he could take on 3 people at the same time. With a few cracking sounds, Brando's shirt and trousers were all torn apart, revealing his strong muscles. His skin was red all over like a cooked shrimp. The blood in his body was boiling, making a sound like thunder. "Come on, bastard." Without exception, Brando began to act like a drunkard. He hugged the horn, raised his head and shouted at the green dragon in the air. The green dragon was the soul of the jade dragon sword, an existence similar to Ovina. It was extremely arrogant and would not allow a mere mortal to slander it. Not to mention, the 11th elder's remnant will was still there. Although it could not control the holy sword, it could still influence its judgment. It immediately roared, curled its tail, which was hundreds of meters long, and swept the green phoenix to the side. Then it dove down towards Brando. Oh no! Mr. Liu, who was connected to the ancient phoenix, was shaken by the jade dragon sword's tail. He almost spat out a mouthful of blood. However, when he saw this scene, he was secretly anxious. Earlier it was like a miracle had happened. He had seen Brando take care of the chariot of ghosts with his own eyes. How could he just watch Brando die in this place? The young man might not be related to him, but he was the only one who could take the young lady away. Moreover, the young man's strength reassured him. With such strength, what could the chariot of ghosts do to the young lady? Mr. Liu panicked and immediately forced himself to use his life to order the ancient phoenix. Under his desperate situation, the green phoenix, who had already shown signs of retreating, let out a clear cry. It spread its wings and chased after the green dragon. However, what Brando did at this time made Mr. Liu want to vomit blood. He saw that the young man seemed to be drunk. Although he was indeed drunk, standing up from the ground, he threw a punch at the Jade Imperial sacred sword that was in the air. Faced with such provocation, the Jade Dragon sword was naturally enraged. It raised its claws and clawed at Brando. There was a series of thunderous sounds in the air. Brando flew back to where he came from like a meteor. He crashed into the harbor and smashed into a warehouse. The building, which was thousands of square meters in size, was reduced to ashes. Even the goods that were burning inside were reduced to ashes. The green dragon, who was entrenched in the air, sneered. It did not even look at the ancient phoenix that was chasing after it. It directly plunged down and chased after Brando. Obviously, it was determined to kill him. As the previous soul of the Holy Sword, it naturally had rich combat experience. And facing the furious attack of a god, Brando, who was lying in the ruins, spat out a mouthful of blood. He only felt that his internal organs seemed to have shifted. However, his mind was muddled. There was no feeling of fear at all. It was as if there was only fury and a burning will to fight left in the chaos. For some reason, Brando thought of the scene when he fought with the Twilight Dragon. The pure fury and fighting instinct in the chaos seemed to be exactly the same. He wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth as if nothing had happened. He turned over and stood up again. The green dragon's claws were descending from the air, but Brando immediately picked up the horn and drank the remaining wine in one gulp. Following that, he let out a furious roar and once again charged towards the azure dragon in midair. His fist struck the center of the azure dragon's claw, and a loud bang rang out as if the sky had been torn apart, causing the entire harbor to tremble. However, under Mr. Liu's dumbfounded gaze, Brando actually blocked the Jade Dragon Sword's attack. Mr. Liu opened his mouth. For a moment he did not know what to say. Then his body swayed slightly, and he fell to the ground. After losing his control, the green phoenix let out a sharp cry. Its whole body was burning with raging flames, and it crashed into the Jade Dragon Sword from the air. At this moment, the green dragon and Brando were confronting each other in the air above the port. Brando, who was in a completely enhanced state, was simply like a demon god. His strength was not inferior to a real silver body at the peak state. The Jade Dragon Sword was naturally a sword close to the gods in its era. Its master was also a legendary figure like the Azure Knight. Unfortunately, in this era the honor did not belong to it. After sensing the ancient phoenix jade pendant behind it, the Jade Dragon Sword's soul finally showed a trace of hesitation on its face. But right at this moment, in a place that no one noticed, a few people were running out of a burning alley near the port with their hands covering their heads. The leading lady dodged the hot smoke and rushed out of the square. When she looked up, she could not help but let out a cry of surprise. "Found it, that's Quill. That's really the power of the Jade Heart. Quick, quick, the messenger of the god of Ra is also there, quickly help him." Not far behind her, the elf ranger looked at the sky with a complicated expression, and then silently took out a box from his arms. P.S. Today's 2 chapters are here. Sigh, it's the end of the month again. To be honest, I've been in a bad state recently. The quality of my writing has dropped a lot because of my condition. If it was before, I would probably have to stop updating and think about life again. However, Amber has dragged on for so long. Besides, it's really embarrassing to keep everyone waiting, so I still insist on writing. In any case, I'll write slowly. Fortunately, after persisting for a while, I finally feel a little better in the last few days. Sure enough, I still have to overcome myself. Chapter 1250. Quill, the omniscient eye is the sacred object of the sun god. It can help you recover the emerald heart because it was originally the possession of the sun god. I understand, Great Elder. The wooden box in Quill's hand was a little gray on the surface of the willow wood, and there was a ring-shaped emblem on the lid. At first glance it looked very ordinary. When he opened the lid, the surrounding knight and Adney couldn't help but look over. They saw that the box was covered with a thin layer of silk satin, and on the silk satin was a metal quadrangular pyramid with a platinum luster, but they didn't see anything related to Thy on it. Instead, the pyramid was densely covered with countless lines and patterns, looking very mysterious. That Quill didn't say a word. His expression was incomparably solemn. He held the box with both hands and raised the quadrangular all up high. He shouted, "R.A.?" A beam of light shot out from the platinum awl, hitting the distant sacred jade sword in midair. And it was also at this moment that the azure phoenix summoned by the ancient phoenix jade amulet was burning with raging flames, and it collided with the azure dragon above the port. The two balls of flames collided with each other, forming a bright ball of flames. At that moment, countless flames flowed in the air like rivers. Wherever the flames passed, the houses on the ground immediately burned up. The Rosaline residents near the port area suffered from this unexpected disaster, and they only felt as if the end of the world had come. Fortunately, the flames didn't spread too fast, and most of them still had time to escape. The azure dragon transformed by the sacred jade sword issued a mournful roar, and almost half of its body's energy form collapsed. After all, although the ancient phoenix jade amulet's power was slightly inferior, it was also a real ancient object, not to mention that in its ownerless state, it could only display 30% of its full power. It didn't expect that its pursuit of an ant would bring it such a big trouble. Under the shock, it no longer cared about Brando's threat, and casually slapped it away. But at this moment, a pure white light suddenly pierced through the smoke clouds above the battlefield, and from the direction where the azure dragon transformed by the sacred jade sword was completely unguarded, it directly hit its chest. It hit. In the thick smoke, a knight shouted in surprise. It succeeded? Seeing the bright brilliance of the omniscient eye in Quill's hand, Adney, the deputy commander of the Raw's Wing Knight Regiment, couldn't help but ask excitedly. Quill looked at the sky with a serious expression. When the white light hit the azure dragon, he indeed felt the power of the jade heart, but it wasn't complete. It should be a part of the remnant laws. He even heard a dignified voice in his mind. Who are you? For some reason, Quill felt that he could understand the meaning of this sentence, even though he clearly didn't understand the other party's language. He immediately quills as the great elder told him, to recall the power's heart's power. But at this time, his eyes hand jade amulet. He s's amulet, eyes and jade eye. It sis amulet. When the azure phoenix and the holy jade sword perished together, Brando was naturally swept up in the explosion. He fell from the sky like a stone, heavily landing in the ruins. The violent impact made him groan in pain, and his dizzy mind finally recovered a trace of clarity. What happened? Where am I? The terrifying aftereffects of the golden wine were still far from being eliminated. He was still in a state of excitement and muddle-headedness. Only, the serious injuries on his body made it impossible for him to be active. The golden liquid in the bugle horn had also been drunk, and there was no possibility of him recovering in a short time. Brando used his last bit of reason, or perhaps instinct, to feel for the angel's heart bottle on his chest, but he stopped halfway through this muddle-headedness. He shook his head with a splitting headache. His head seemed to be covered with several layers of things, and it was incomparably heavy when he shook it. His eyes were half illusory, half real, as if full of wandering thoughts and illusions. That kind of feeling was like waking up from a dream. Nothing felt real and it was incomparably painful. He sighed heavily. What the hell is going on? He felt a buzzing sound in his head, as if there was a voice that was urgently trying to tell him something, but he couldn't hear it clearly. His remaining trace of clarity also made him feel that there was something urgent that he had to do. Unfortunately, except for this thought, the power of the hero's wine made him unable to do anything. Even if he took the initiative to move his little finger, it was the same. However, it was at this time that a pair of white wings of light suddenly stretched out from behind him. Then, balls of light of various colors rose from his chest one by one. The sky blue one from before represented the will of the flowing wind and the firmament. Then it was azure, representing the light of the shallow sea and wisdom. Then it was light gray, representing the heaviness of the earth and the breadth of everything. There was also golden flame, unruly resistance and unyielding spirit. Finally, it was pitch black, the cold and indifferent pitch black holy sword annihilation, and the scepter of nature emitting a green light. 5 swords and a scepter glittered in the sea of flames of the ruins. Among them, the scepter of nature's green light was especially dazzling. It flashed and disappeared, as if it was calling something from the unseen world. Thick smoke billowed up. In midair, the azure dragon formed by the Jade Imperial sacred sword was letting out its final sorrowful cry. It raised its huge dragon head and let out an earth-shattering roar. The ancient Phoenix Jade Amulet's suicidal attack, and the power of the omniscient eye finally made it unable to resist. The huge illusory dragon suddenly shrunk, and then completely expanded. It was as if countless green specks of light had exploded and scattered in all directions. The specks of light merged into the smoke and flames that filled the sky. However, in the midst of these azure lights, a much brighter ball of light was slowly rising. The clouds above slowly parted, revealing the faint silver lines of the Tiamat Law. These lines of law spanning thousands of kilometers were slowly rotating, forming a huge array. Then a bright beam of light hung down from the center of the array, enveloping the ball of light. If Brando was still conscious at this moment, he would definitely be able to tell that this was a battle spell cast by someone thousands of kilometers away. These spells, which could easily reach thousands of kilometers, were the top powers of the magi in this world. It could not be completed without several supreme magi. They were often called 13-circle or even 14-circle spells, and this spell seemed to be used to summon the Jade Imperial's sacred sword soul. But it was at this time that the green ball of light seemed to be hesitating. It shook violently as if it was resisting something, but in the end, it finally made a decision and broke free from the range of the green beam of light. Suddenly it plunged down towards Brando, who was unable to move. At that moment, the light of the nature staff floating above Brando became incomparably strong. As if responding to its call, the ball of light directly sank into the multicolored ball of light in front of Brando's chest. Brando groaned and frowned. Unconsciously, he felt that the power of the emerald green had improved a bit, and the power of nature was the most important thing. The emerald green suddenly lit up, and the overflowing power almost immediately began to repair Brando's severely damaged body. This is the power of the nature pearl. Although Brando was confused at this moment, his heart suddenly reacted. He couldn't help but be pleasantly surprised. He was trying to mobilize this power to restore his body, but before he could be happy, another power suddenly came from the void. Brando was aghast, because he discovered that it was the power of the ancient Phoenix Jade Talisman. In theory, after the ancient Phoenix Jade Talisman was activated, it should have completely dissipated from this world along with the dissipation of its power. But after the Azure Phoenix collided with the Jade Imperial's sacred sword and perished together, the dissipated power drifted in the air for a moment. Suddenly, as if it was possessed, it chose to do the same thing as the Jade Imperial's sacred sword. That was, it suddenly turned in the air, and then plunged into the ball of light in front of Brando's chest. Brando was suddenly thrown into disarray. The power of the nature pearl could be said to be in harmony with the power of the nature scepter or even the power of the other elemental pearls, but the power of the ancient Phoenix Jade Talisman could be said to be incompatible with it. Brando couldn't distinguish what kind of power it was, but he could feel that it was incomparably decisive, as if it had the same momentum as the Jade Imperial's sacred sword. Not to mention that a moment ago they were still fighting to the death, and this hatred had obviously continued until now. The moment the two forces gathered together, Brando felt as if there was a big bomb in front of him. This terrifying power abruptly woke Brando up from his drunken state. He suddenly broke out in a cold sweat and opened his eyes, subconsciously wanting to separate them. But what made him break out in a cold sweat was that he was shocked to find that although his mind was sober, his body was still unable to move. The golden wine of the Termosai people was really worthy of its reputation. He couldn't help but curse those people in his heart. But cursing the Termosai people wouldn't help solve the current situation. The two forces became more and more unstable. Just before they were about to completely erupt, Brando finally found that the 5 sacred swords and the nature scepter floating in front of him had begun to play a role. They seemed to have wisdom, each releasing their own elemental power, and began to intervene in the dispute between the ancient Phoenix Jade Talisman and the Jade Imperial Sacred Sword. Chapter 1251. Under the suppression of several top elemental forces that were second only to the power of existence, the two forces were finally restrained to a balanced state. Brando could feel that Verdant was slowly absorbing the power of the nature pearl on the sacred jade sword. As long as this power was completely absorbed, the ancient Phoenix Jade pendant should not be so manic anymore. Of course, this should be the case if he thought about it on the bright side. Brando could only pray that Lady Martha was not joking with him. However, He also confirmed that this sword did indeed have a part of the power of the nature pearl, which was no different from his previous guess. Although he was almost killed by the Termosian, at least he had some gains and did not suffer a big loss for nothing. However, he could clearly feel that the aura of the nature pearl on the sword was very thin, and the law elements were incomplete. Obviously, this sword had existed for a long time before the azure lance firmament. At the moment, he could not move and could only lie silently in the ruins, waiting for Verdant to complete her task. At the same time, his mind was still a little confused. The effect of the golden wine was obviously far from over. Dizziness and sleepiness were coming in waves. He tried to keep himself awake, his mind wandering about some of the things that happened before. He thought of the stagnant realm and the heart of the azure dragon that Phoenix Hua mentioned. According to what Delphian told him in the diary, he now suspected that the sacred jade sword should be like Cinna and the black pearl, which was taken apart and cast into many different sacred objects. According to his experience, the real sacred jade sword should be made up of the complete version of Verdant, including the nature staff, nature pearl, and nature sacred sword, and the other half of it should be the wind-type sacred sword, Firmament. But after its time, when a new amber sword was born, which was likely the azure lance, Firmament, the wind-type sacred sword was taken away by the azure knight after the majestic mountain trial, just like how he took Firmament from the azure lance. The remaining half of the emerald also fell apart. It was unknown how the nature's staff had fallen into the Dragon Queen's hands. A part of the nature's pearl remained in the jade dragon sword. As for the other part, it was very likely to be in the heart of the jade dragon that Huang Hua had mentioned more than once. Brando couldn't help but frown. He had heard that this thing was the most precious treasure of the nine-headed phoenix. He didn't know what kind of symbolic significance it had to the Jade Phoenix clan. But if what Delphian said was true, he was determined to obtain this nature orb. He only hoped that there wouldn't be any conflict with Huang Hua's family. He silently thought about these messy things, waiting for Tsang Chui to slowly extract the power of the nature pearl from the sacred jade sword. But it was at this time that his sensitive perception suddenly heard a scream from afar. To be honest, that voice was a little familiar. However, Brando suddenly had a bad premonition. It seemed that Lady Martha was really going to play a joke on him. "I can't control it," the voice cried out in horror. Quill was indeed unable to control the omniscient eye in his hands. The Great Elder had high hopes for him, and had also entrusted him with an important task. He was indeed the most outstanding and reliable gravekeeper of this generation. On his journey to Rosaline, he had experimented with how to control the omniscient eye countless times to ensure that nothing went wrong. He didn't dare to say that he could completely control this holy object, but he could at least do it like the back of his hand. However, that incomparably tyrannical power had completely destroyed all his hopes. First, it mercilessly sealed his connection with the Emerald Heart. Then it followed his control of the omniscient eye and crept over, directly seizing his authority. It didn't even give him any time to react. It was as if the omniscient eye belonged to it. Quill reacted quickly. He immediately slammed the box shut. The box was made of desert wallow and was engraved with a holy magic array. Not only could it isolate the aura of the omniscient eye, it could also block the invasion of evil spirits and demonic wills. "Come and help, Adney. I'm in trouble." He wasn't pretentious and immediately turned to shout at the knight. Before Adney and the others could recover from their surprise, they saw that their elven companion's face had turned ashen. Although they didn't know what had happened, they had been working together for such a long time, and immediately understood each other's intentions. A few knights immediately rushed forward to help Quill hold the box down. However, just as they touched it, their faces were filled with shock. They weren't as powerful as Quill or their deputy commander, but they were still close to the standard of the elemental enlightenment. Otherwise, how could they have joined the Knight Regiment of Ra's Wings? This was one of the most sacred knight regiments in Lubian. However, even with their combined strength, they found that they were about to lose their grip on the box. The knight couldn't help but turn pale and said in a trembling voice, "Deputy Commander, come and help." In a moment of desperation, they even shouted out Adney's original position and name. Adney couldn't care less as she hurriedly darted forward. But before she could place her hand on the box, Quill had already warned her in a low voice, "Don't worry, be careful." Before his voice had died away, the willow box sprang open by itself, and the omniscient eye flew out like a dancing stream of light. Only the knight was left there, looking at each other in dismay. However, at this moment, Brando was in even greater trouble, because the ancient Phoenix Jade Amulet and the sacred Jade Sword had been maintaining a relatively balanced state for less than a minute. Suddenly, a grayish-white light broke through the fog and directly merged into the ball of light. "What the hell is this?" Brando exclaimed in his heart. If the ancient Phoenix Jade Amulet could be said to be prepared in advance, then the last thing was completely out of his expectations. After all, he was well aware of the level of existence of the ancient Phoenix Jade Amulet and the sacred Jade Sword in this world. It was already a coincidence that Amir Luo Celine was able to gather two of these items. What the hell was this third item? However, the exclamation in his heart couldn't change the situation in front of him. The ancient Phoenix Jade Amulet, the sacred Jade Sword, and the omniscient eye converged together. Everything that happened next could be predicted. Through the thick smoke and the flames that filled the sky, the Knights of Ra's Wings were completely unaware of the disaster that was about to befall them. What happened? Adney seemed to have not recovered from the previous shock. She looked at the others and couldn't help but ask subconsciously. However, at this time, she heard someone behind her cry out in alarm. "Be careful." Adney was caught off guard and looked forward. She was just in time to hear an earth-shattering explosion. It was as if the sky and earth were falling apart. Then a fierce white light reflected in her eyes, and a shockwave swept through the thick smoke. She only had time to let out a scream before she was blown away like a piece of paper. Along with her, the Knight of Ra's Wings were also blown away. The explosion seemed to have created a storm. It swept up countless pieces of rubble and wreckage of the buildings and extended forward. It actually scraped off a layer of the stone slabs on the street, exposing the layer of soil underneath. The roaring sound drowned out everything in an instant. It was as if nothing else could be heard in the midst of the high-pitched roar. The white light expanded in all directions, engulfing the entire pier, the entire harbor area, and even the outer shack area. Among everyone, the only one who had time to see this scene was the gravekeeper, Quill. He looked at all of this with his mouth agape. The brilliance of the gravekeeper's protection that was exuding from his body became dimmer and dimmer until it finally disappeared. The white light completely swallowed him up. How can this be? Why can't I retrieve the power of the Emerald Heart? At the last moment before losing consciousness, the elf's mind was still in a mess as he pondered this question. The explosion lasted for about a minute or two. During this period of time, the entire area of Rosaline seemed to have experienced a terrifying earthquake. Half of Rosaline Castle had collapsed. Fortunately, the Lord of Rosaline had not returned to his residence. Otherwise, he would have been in deep trouble. Phoenix Hua Blank and the residents of Rosaline had experienced all of this. Although they did not know what had happened in the port area, it did not prevent them from seeing the horrifying scene caused by the explosion in that direction. At the moment when the white light was at its brightest, the whole world seemed to have darkened. Only the dazzling ball of light was left. Then the shockwave swept across and almost destroyed half of the city. Fortunately, most of the buildings in Rosaline were shacks, so there were not too many casualties if they were further away. What was strange was that although the explosion was very violent, its range was very narrow. Except for the deep crater in the port, even the shantytown nearby was only affected by the subsequent shockwave. The shockwave was like a gust of wind, and it didn't even cause too many casualties. It felt as if there was an invisible force that restricted the explosion to the port area. Outside the port, on the road from the town to Rosaline Castle, Feng Qi was staring at this scene in a daze. After almost a moment, he let out a scream. "Holy Jade Sword! We have to go back." Feng Qi panted and his face was flushed. He seemed to be a little nervous as he muttered to himself, No, we have to at least figure out what's wrong with the Holy Jade Sword." Of course. Don't you want to go with me, Miss Delphian? I thought the first thing you would do would be to escape immediately. After all, this is a wise choice." Delphian replied quietly. Feng Qi was stunned for a moment, but then he shook his head and said through gritted teeth, "Escaping is not a problem. No one can stop me from leaving this place, but nothing can happen to the Jade Imperial Sacred Sword." Delphian just looked at him quietly as if she had expected this. P.S. Last bit of time, continue to ask for next month's votes, and also for next month's guarantee. Chapter 1252. Unlike the previous years, after a few autumn rains, the areas north of Tanajil that were affected by the autumn monsoon began to clear up. It was as if it was truly a scene of autumn, completely cutting off the impression that the southern part of Erewhon was covered in autumn rain. The rare lack of rain also affected the war that stretched from Bucci to Radnor. The allied forces of Duke Grinoires and Duke Vero had underestimated the weather and miscalculated the undead's attack. As a result, they had been pushed back by the Roman Tuo's Black Rose offensive. After the two battles in Manowir Forest and the outskirts of Braggs, the front line of the undead had advanced to the south of Kirkle. Even though the speed of their advance was much slower than Erewhon's defeat in the Second War of the Black Rose in his previous life, Radnor still expressed their dissatisfaction with the royal faction. For this reason, Makarov and Lone Wolf Oberway, who had been conferred the title of Count Fao, had already left for the front line. Eek, Buga the Cross, and the second batch of reinforcements led by Anthony were also on their way. A week ago, part of Tanajil's army stationed in Radnor had also been mobilized. This vanguard was led by the White Lion Guard's vice-commander, Carglaise Huberto, and was accompanied by half of Erewhon's Royal Knight Regiment. It was worth mentioning that the future captain of the Royal Knight Regiment, Moke, was the commander of this half of the regiment. Just like in his previous life, he was now a symbol of the younger generation of the Knight Regiment, and had also entered the corps of the upper echelons. He was deeply trusted by Count Janalesu and Oberway. As for the other two of the three heroes of Erewhon, Loka and Breton of the Elvis family were also heading south from the north. Ever since the incident in the Cruz Empire half a month ago, there was no need for the White Lion Legion to remain in the Anzaruta Highlands. Under Oberway's instructions, they passed through Ampere Seal and went south through Erech. They had now passed through the FAO region. They brought not only the strength of the White Lion Legion, but also the support of the eldest son of the king. Under the leadership of the eldest son of the king, Levin Ornessen Cipher, the northern nobles sent an allied army south. The commanders were the sword-master Nicholas of the Cipher royal family, and the Count of Grey Mountain, with Garlock of the Wanderer accompanying them. It could be said that after Fleetwood's death, Garlock represented the strongest sorcerer force in the kingdom of Erewhon other than Brando's follower, the Shire. Of course, the sorcerers of the Tower who did not belong to the kingdom were an exception. At this point, including the Highland Knight of Karsuk, Erewhon could be said to have completed the general mobilization of the whole country. The various sources of soldiers added up to nearly 150,000. With the poor population of Erewhon, it could be said to be the strength of the country. But everyone, including the royal faction, understood that although the kingdom was united and the source of soldiers was barely enough to fight, the real problem of Erewhon was that the power of the upper class was too far apart from that of Madara. Due to the arrival of the demonic wave, almost all of the new generation of generals in Madara had crossed the threshold of elemental awakening. Undead lords like the Queen of Banshees and the Pale Lord who had survived the dark age of the Roman Black Rose had the strength of elemental realm. Some of them were even above the elemental awakening. Moreover, the strength of the Kingdom of the Dead Moon was not inferior to that of the Cruz Empire. Even in this era, they also had the strength of Supreme Realm. However, they were arranged in the direction of Saint-Tossol, the Great Glacier and Fanzin. Obviously, this Dark Kingdom had used Erewhon as a place to train the new generation of generals from the beginning. This fact was very helpless, but Erewhon could only choose to accept it and feel lucky because of this. Otherwise, with the strength of the kingdom, there was no way they could fight back. Even now, in the face of Madara's high-ranking troops and numerous elemental awakeners, everyone knew that Erewhon's Real Winning Hand was the new force from Tanajil. After all, it had not been long since Brando turned the Empire upside down. During this period, whether it was the Gargoyles or the Steel Golem army in his hands, they all represented the powerful force behind this lord. Not to mention, the fleet supported by the Bugas was the only force in the southern region of Cruz that could decide the ownership of the sky. As for how many hidden forces there were in Tanajil's territory and in the Black Forest that Brando had been exploiting, it was even more difficult to say. At least, the Wind Archers, Druids, Centaurs and Forest Elves were on the table, not to mention the White Lion Guards that made a name for themselves in the war in Ampere Seal. It was also rumored that the Count had a troop of caveman cavalry that was not inferior in combat strength. This rumor spread after the war in Tanajul. But before the end of September, not everyone showed kindness to these country bumpkins from Abes. The conflict between the Count and the Empire had once caused an uproar in Erewhon. Not only did it attract the attacks of the nobles who were used to bowing to the people of Cruz, even the royal faction, who had always been allies of the princess, expressed their dissatisfaction. In the first week of September there was even a civil strife. It was mainly due to the collusion between the royal faction and the northern nobles, but it was hard to say how much of it was due to the jealousy and dissatisfaction of the new forces in the kingdom. Fortunately, the rebellion was suppressed by the joint efforts of Tanajul and Princess Tilly before it could happen. Of course, there were also rumors that this was a trap set up by Count Trenthium's mistress after obtaining the former's permission. The aftermath of the rebellion fermented in September and October, during which many heads fell to the ground. During this period, Princess Grufine and Amandina's resoluteness and decisiveness attracted everyone's attention. After all, for a long time after the Battle of Ampere Seal, Princess Grufine had appeared in front of everyone with a weak side. The subsequent development of this incident caused a rift between the princess and the royal faction, but in the end, both sides reached a compromise under the mediation of Lone Wolf Oberway. The new royal faction represented by Makarov's party pledged their loyalty to the royal family. However, after this incident, the strength and prestige of the princess faction increased greatly, but that was a matter for another day. In any case, after the middle of September, although Brando completely disappeared and was not present, the title of Count Tanajul truly became a political force in Erewhon that could not be ignored and officially stepped onto the stage of the kingdom. After that, there was continuous reorganization, mobilization, and logistical deployment. The name of Amandina was also known throughout the kingdom, because of a series of events in the past month. Naturally, the rumors about the mistress of Count Tanajul naturally spread like wildfire. Amandina was always teased by her subordinates and the people of Abes because of this, and even the princess looked at her a little strangely recently. Amandina had been troubled by this matter for a long time. Looking north from the Schaflund Hills, the sky was blue as if it had just been washed clean. Clouds like smoke floated in the azure blue sky, and the forest of Paulus in the distance was like an emerald inlaid in the mountains. This was a rare good weather in Tanajul during this season, probably due to the fall of the black moon. The sunny days after autumn had lasted for almost a month. When the stars fell that day, strange pillars of light rose from all over Erewhon and minimized the damage to the kingdom. After that day, news gathered from Cruz and St. All could prove that Fanzin was probably not far behind. Wheat and cotton were growing well in the farmland from Gars Ferry to Menta, and there should be a bumper harvest this year. However, if the sunny weather continued until winter, the next year's planting would be affected. The news from the Astrologer Guild seemed to confirm this concern. The World Tree. This was the new name of Valhalla Fortress among the locals of Abes. When this giant tree began to grow under the nourishment of the light spirit and reached the fourth stage of growth, its lush canopy could no longer be hidden by the hills of Schaflund. The fortress could no longer be kept a secret. After discussing with Reto and the others, Amandina decided to open up the perimeter of Valhalla. After all, the next step was to start the migration and resettlement work. According to Brando's plan, the people from Abes and Menta would be able to fill up the lower city of Valhalla. The lower city was renovated by Odum, the descendant of the Rune Dwarves, after a year and a half, and was finally completed in the 7th month. In fact, there were already a few districts that had begun to move in. Although the immigrants were initially reluctant to move, they were completely shocked when they arrived. After staying for a period of time, it could be said that there was no one who was dissatisfied with the city that was powered by magic. The only dissatisfaction was that the businesses in the city had yet to flourish. Because Valhalla was not completely open to the public, Tanajul's businesses were still done in Abes Fortress and Port Gristur. Most of the merchants who were close to Tanajul had more or less heard rumors about the fortress. At this point, after Valhalla sent off the Cruz Crown Prince and his Knight Corps, it could be said that it finally welcomed its first batch of residents. The first to move into the city were naturally Tanajul's most loyal subjects, Brando's most loyal subjects. Although Brando had more or less no concept of loyalty, under Amandina's screening, Even if the royal faction and other forces were able to place spies in the city, it would not cause too much trouble. Not to mention, when Brando went to the north, Amandina took the opportunity to deal with the royal faction's conservative forces to let the Reto and his veterans form a secret intelligence organization. Although Amandina did not have any concept of the secret police, the nobles of Wonde all had their own spies, so it was not strange at all. Even Princess Griffine did not ask about it. As veterans who had been in the war for many years, Reto and the others had not come into contact with the work of spies. However, there were little things like the light spirits in Valhalla that did not attract too much attention. With the help of these ever-present eyes, Reto's subordinates did not perform well in the outside world, but at least they did a good job of keeping the old copper dragon in check. Until now, under the joint protection of Coden's city guards and the spies, Valhalla had smoothly passed through the most difficult period. The new residents in the city had also gradually become familiar with their new home. Chapter 1253. However, on this day when Valhalla's tree canopy began to adjust the direction of its leaves, sunlight shone through the dense layers of branches and began to illuminate the lower city. Valhalla's new residents left their houses and walked onto the streets, only to discover that this fortress was a bit different from before. Trees that resembled lampposts grew along the streets of the city, with one or more moonstones hanging from the curled branches. During the day, the crystals would absorb sunlight, and at night, they would emit a gentle moonlight that illuminated the entire lower city. They would also attract fireflies to look for food around them, decorating the city as if it was a dream. But early in the morning, the people discovered that the lampposts had flowers growing beside them, with ribbons hanging from them. Above the city, Valhalla's main trunk stretched out horizontally, hanging down streaks of colorful silk with the silver lily coat of arms of the Corvado royal family. At the end of the silk was the insignia of the Abbes. This wasn't the first time the new residents of Valhalla had seen such a scene. Valhalla hadn't hired any city workers yet, so this was definitely the handiwork of the radiant spirits. They decorated the city at night, taking advantage of the arrival of dawn to give everyone a surprise, and this wasn't the first time. The last time was before the sacred fire rite, and the people couldn't help but wonder what festival it was. But no matter how hard they racked their brains, they couldn't figure out what festival it was. The autumn harvest festival was still a long time away, and with the rumors of war coming from the north, there was no way they would hold a festival at this time. People gathered on the streets in twos and threes, discussing the strange scene in front of them. Some of them were still doubting whether the light spirits had made a mistake again, but some of them with good eyesight had already put their hands over their eyes, squinting their eyes as they looked at the upper regions of Valhalla. Above the main trunk of Valhalla, there were rows of tree trunks extending horizontally above the lower city. The leaves growing on these trunks would regulate and guide rainwater for the entire city in rainy weather, as well as provide shade for the streets below. They were even used to hang banners and silk satin to add to the festive atmosphere, just like now. Above the trunks were many platforms that extended out. These platforms weren't directly connected like the lower city, and above them were the important craftsmen's quarters and barracks. There was even a commercial district within, but it wasn't open for the time being. These areas were connected through the trunks, which was why there were no drawbridges or planks around the platforms. Above them was the upper region of Valhalla. The new residents of the city now understood that it was the administrative area where the Count's castle was located. At this moment, they were staring at the second platform in that direction. It was originally Valhalla's backup spaceport, which was also the spaceport of the Corvado royal family. By the way, Princess Griffine and her Knight Order had been staying in Tonagel for a long time, to the point that the royal faction had some complaints about it. But anyone with a discerning eye could see that the princess of the kingdom had feelings for their lord. There were even rumors that Ondina, the actual person in charge of Ferber, was jealous of the princess. It was so vivid that it was loved by the bards. Fortunately, no one dared to spread these rumors to the upper region of Yggdrasil, including Griffine's Knight Order, who often came to the lower city for fun. Otherwise, who knew what kind of trouble it would cause? At this moment, the new residents who raised their heads saw that the spaceport used by the royal family was crowded with people. It was obvious that there were many people gathered there, as if a grand welcoming ceremony was being held. Who's here? Could it be that Count Griffine has returned? For the new residents of Valhalla, They only knew that their Count Grafine had gone to the Empire as an ambassador. Of course, the drama of Grafine beating up the Empire's people was naturally arranged by a certain lady. The bards sang about it in bars all over Tanajul. Regardless of whether it was the residents of Abi's castle or Maxen, they were all happy to hear about it. Even the merchants from Cruz listened to it with great interest. After all, most of them did not like the nobles of the empire. As for nationalism, it had not yet begun to sprout in Wound. However, news about Brando's disappearance had been strictly blocked by Amandina. Until now, not to mention where Brando was, even the huge changes that happened in the Cruz Empire had not been transmitted to Tanajul. There were only occasional rumors in some areas and no one paid attention to it. But these people were not completely wrong. Princess Grafine rarely used the spaceport used by the royal family, and it was indeed to welcome the return of some people. On the platform, a military band formed by the light spirits was playing. These little fellows were holding instruments that were one size smaller than themselves. Under Monica's command they played quite well, but they were a little restless, and their formation in the air was a little crooked. Princess Grafine did not care about the mischievous little fellows. She silently listened to the gentle tune of Lilies and Dawn, her thoughts drifting off to God knows where. This was the military song of the royal family of Erewhon's Knight Regiment, and it was also the exclusive music of the royal family. It was written by Valadin in 332. A silver warship was passing through the clouds. Count Eltif slowly descended from the clouds. In accordance with the Buga style, the ship's sides and keel were luxuriously plated with a layer of silver. At this moment all the sails on this second-class cruiser were full, and it looked like another white cloud. The sailors on the ship rang the bell, and then began to slow down. They lowered the ropes and raised the sails. The captain used the communication crystal to report the ship's current status and mission to Valhalla spaceport. Then, 2 vines shot out from the tree branches outside the platform and grabbed onto the hull of the 3-masted sailing ship. Under the guidance of these 2 vines, Count Eltif slowly began to dock. Amandina stood behind Princess Grafine with a calm expression, but the uneasiness in her eyes betrayed her true feelings. Although the bad news from Erewhon had reached Valhalla, and the Shire and Scarlet had returned to Tanajul ahead of time, there was still no news of Medisha and the Roman aunt. Right now she had to hold on to any hope. The ship steadily docked, and the trumpeter on the ship blew 3 times in response to the port's cannons. Then, a gangplank was lowered from the side of the ship. There were handrails on both sides of the gangplank, and then Yuda's figure appeared there. The former mercenary commander was now the captain of the night. After carefully inspecting the gangplank, she took a step back, revealing Haruz behind her. The little prince and Lasmika, who had been by his side, got off the ship, accompanied by the dark elf lady they met in Anzaruta. The customs of the inhabitants of Georgandy Ridge were very different from those on the ground. The lady was dressed in hot clothes, and in addition to her slender thighs, her strong waist was completely exposed. The thin wrap on her chest was really short, and her 2 southern hemispheres were completely exposed. Her skin was dark and delicate, and Amandina and Princess Grafine could not help but blush a little, thinking that this woman was really shameless. Her Royal Highness had made up her mind to interrogate her only brother. The future king of Erewhon was not going to be a Puritan, but the women around Haruz were a little too strange, not to mention that he was still young. Looking at her only brother in the world, and the only heir to the royal bloodline of Covardo, she had never let him out of her sight for such a long time since she was sensible. The last time was the adventure in the deadly frost forest. Although it was more dangerous, it was much shorter than this trip. Grafine's heart was full of softness, but her words became incomparably cold. Haruz, the sister. Although Haruz still seemed a little naturally afraid of her, Grafine could see that after this experience, her brother had faintly gained some manliness. His slightly tanned skin could prove this. Thinking of this, she could not help but be filled with gratitude to Brando. But on the other hand, this feeling was a little complicated. She opened her mouth and asked, "What about the Count?" Teacher, he. Haruz's eyes were red, and he was almost crying. Although he had been flying in the sky all the way, he still had to stop and resupply when he passed by Ampere Seal. Moreover, when the fleet passed by Cypher, he had to send Chiara and the others one by one to their family's territory, so he had already known what had happened in the Cruz Empire. After the day of the Black Moon's fall, Lushta was completely wiped off the map. No one knew what happened within a few hundred kilometers of that place. They only knew that some dragons later brought out news that a spatial rift had opened there, and monsters of chaos were constantly pouring out from it. Now, East Metz and Cloak Bay had not been peaceful for long before they became the front line again. But this time, Cruz's eldest son no longer had to deal with his mother, but those inhumane monsters. It was said that a branch of the Bugas had already gone to the Empire. After the fall of the floating city, which he had just learned of, this was the first time the Bugas had appeared in front of the world. Amandina looked at Maynard on the side. The latter nodded at her with a gloomy face. Amandina could not help but cover her mouth, her face was pale, and her whole body almost went limp. Ever since the Shire and Scarlet returned, she had hoped that Brando and Medisha would meet Haru's fleet. But now this hope was shattered. But she immediately felt a delicate and slender hand holding her own. She felt a little warmth coming from the palm of her hand. Amandina could not help but raise her head in surprise. She saw Princess Graphine's silver eyes looking at her seriously. "Cheer up, Amandina, the Count is fine. Mr. the Shire is still here, isn't he?" After the civil strife in September, her relationship with Amandina had been closely tied by the alliance between the royal family and Tanajul. The private relationship between the two had also gradually warmed up, and under Amandina's intentional pandering, they had already become good friends who talked about everything. And in the early days, the princess had already known about Brando's identity as a planeswalker. Amandina came back to her senses. She was actually worried and confused, so she quickly nodded and collected her emotions with difficulty. "Thank you, Your Highness." Grafine only forced a smile at her. Obviously, Brando's disappearance was also a heavy blow to her. But Amandina's heart was even more troubled. She did not know how to tell Freya and Scarlet this news. Although the former had already gone to Ranner and gathered with the White Lion Guards, in fact, she had been hiding things about the Roman from them. As for the latter, Amandina was even more troubled. She knew very well that compared to herself, the mountain girl was more dependent on her lord. Oh. Chapter 1255. The reception ceremony at the royal family's spaceport was short, and soon the people's attention shifted to the fleet's return. It had been more than 2 months since the Tanajul fleet left Valhalla, and the new residents of Valhalla had only heard of the fleet's name. Strictly speaking, this was the first time they had seen the fleet with their own eyes. Although the ships entering the port at this moment were not the full picture of the fleet had been ordered by the princess to split into 3 when they passed through Cypher. A patrol fleet was sent to continue escorting Erwin's envoy, while another fleet with 3 third-class cruisers as the main force was sent to the Laban coast north of Karsuk to seal off the mountain range to prevent the undead from playing the trick of ambushing Lantern Island and Viro's rear in the last war. And today, the fleet that returned to Tanajul was actually less than half of the huge fleet in Erwin and even in the south of Cruz. But even so, it did not dampen the people's enthusiasm. The news quickly spread, and when the new residents of Valhalla ran out of their homes and saw the silver dots of light descending from the clouds, most of them were small gunships and some were transport ships, they could not help but whistle and cheer. The citizens even took off their hats and threw them at the fleet in the sky, as if that was the only way to express their excitement. After all, this was the fleet that belonged to the Tanajul, and also the fleet that belonged to Abes. It was the fleet that belonged to their lord, even though Brando bought them from the Bugas. But what did it matter? Who did not know that the craftsman mages were arrogant, and not just any noble could be associated with them? At least, the people of Abes deeply believed in one thing. Their lord was the descendant of the Highland Knight, and was a young man that the mages of the tower thought highly of. That was why the craftsman mages thought highly of him. The Shire Lord who followed their lord was the best proof. He was a great mage. Didn't he also build a mage tower in their lord's territory? Sunders was an emissary from Grey Mountain. Although Grey Mountain family was in the north during the last war, it did not change the fact that they were closer to Corvado. However, Count Grey Mountain always had a grudge against the royal faction, so when Fleetwood and Makarov were in charge, Count Grey Mountain had to consider his position in the south and his family's interests. But when Her Highness the eldest princess expressed her disagreement with the royal faction, an envoy from the Grey Mountain immediately traveled south from Vladipest to Tanajul. Of course, only those who knew the inside story would understand that the more important reason was that after the Second War of the Black Roses began, Levin Cipher and the princess were showing signs of reconciliation. 3 months ago, the current leader of House Cipher ignored the opposition of his mother, Queen Anna, and liberated the noble parliament in the north. This caused the Northern Alliance, which was formed after the war in Ampere Seal, to collapse in an instant. After that, he defeated a small group of nobles from Yenbao, Tuvelo, and Balta as well as the Thornwolf family's small-scale rebellion. The first thing he did after that was not to mobilize his troops to the south, but to send out an alliance of nobles with Nicholas as the commander to support the war between House Covardo and Madara. This incident caused Princess Grafine to remain silent for several days. After that, she reopened the free port of Ampere Seal to the north, showing her goodwill. Now, in some areas north of Ampere Seal, it was obvious that the situation was getting better day by day. This was the opposite of the increasingly tense atmosphere in the south from Ranner to Manorville. It was under such circumstances that Saunders arrived in Tanagal. He knew that Princess Grafine had a good relationship with her cousin when they were young. Later, due to Queen Anna, the two families gradually drifted apart. Now that they were showing signs of mending their relationship, it might mean that House Corvado and House Cipher were reconciling. To Erwin, this was even more important than the war at hand. On the surface, he represented the Count of Grey Mountain, but in fact, he was the special envoy of Prince Levin Cipher. However, although the people in Tanagal were friendly, the princess did not seem to want to meet him for the time being. King Oberg's death left a deep scar between the two families. After all, it was not something that could be healed in a short time. Saunders rented a room on the second floor of the Mermaid Inn in the city. The ubiquitous light spirits in the city had arranged a place for him in the upper district. However, he preferred to wander around the lower district. The upper district was luxurious and elegant, which fit the aesthetic standards of nobles, but there were too few people. There was no trace of life. Fortunately, the people in Tanagal did not restrict his freedom. Before he was received by the princess, he moved out and settled down in this place. Most people knew about this, but no one came to stop him. Saunders was happy to have some free time. He knew that his mission was not something that could be completed overnight. In fact, he was more curious about this fortress. He traveled to various places in Erwin several years ago, and naturally he also visited the barren land of Tanagal. However, he never heard of such a giant tree here. He heard that the Lord brought the tree back from the loop of trade winds. He also heard about the legendary story of the Lord. It was a pity that he never got the chance to meet the Lord in person. While cheering outside, Saunders and his attendant were looking out of the window on the second floor. The latter was a country bumpkin from Tanagal. He was not very knowledgeable. Other than complaining about the hot weather in Tanagal and looking for people to gamble, he had no other good points. Saunders chose this person because the latter was honest and obedient. Sometimes this could be considered a good point. The man almost fell from the window and yelled to his master, "Oh my God, master! These ships are flying in the sky." Of course, Saunders had seen ships flying in the sky before. As a matter of fact, he had seen the wind warships of the Erwin royal family in Yanalasu, and the local fleet of the Empire in Anzaruta. However, they were nothing like this. His eyes reflected the scenery in the sky, and his heart was filled with complicated emotions. It was just a fleet that belonged to the people of Awin, and it had just returned from the Empire. There, it and its masters had done many things that the people of Awin could never imagine in their lifetime. Brando's journey in the Empire was mostly praised and criticized by the nobles. However, the common people, especially in places like Tanagal and Ranner, praised him in unison. Some people claimed that this lord was the most outstanding envoy leader of Erwin royal family in recent years. Some even compared him to his grandfather 60 years ago. Even the elder princess, who had a keen eye for people, gained a lot of fame because of this. There were already many rumors about the knight and the princess. However, this fleet was simply too powerful. It was so powerful that it was suffocating. As the special envoy of Levin Cipher, he was well aware of the thoughts of the blind prince. The prince had repeatedly urged him to think of a way to win over the feudal lord, or at least win his favor. He stared at the floating light spots above the clouds in a daze. He thought silently in his heart. In an era where such a powerful person was born, he did not know whether it was a blessing or a curse for the small country of Erwin royal family. Was he an imitator of the late King Eric? Or the next Duke Erek? Back in the upper region of Valhalla, the forest palace Brendel had specially reserved for the royal family. In fact, Her Royal Highness Princess Grafine waited until the maid turned around and closed the door with a click. The serious and cold image that Princess Grafine had maintained throughout the journey could no longer be maintained. She turned around and carefully examined her only brother from head to toe. "Are you really not hurt, Haruz?" "Yes, it's all thanks to teacher, but he..." "That's great, Haruz, that's great, you're finally back." Haruz opened his mouth wide and stared blankly at his sister. Even the second half of the sentence was blocked by his sister's choked voice. He had never seen her lose her composure like this in his life. Grafine put her arms around his short and thin shoulders, lowered her head, and sobbed quietly. Her tears could not stop falling, drop by drop rolling onto the thick carpet, forming beautiful crystal beads. "Sister! Sister!" Haruz panicked. "I'm fine, Haruz, I'm just too scared." Grafine hurriedly raised her head. She took a breath and reorganized her emotions that were on the verge of collapse. She wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes and cheeks with the back of her hand. "You're right, it's all thanks to the prince. We'll find him." "Sister, you called teacher?" "Haruz Ornesan sent me a letter." "Brother Levin." Haruz reacted in an instant, equating the name with the person in his memory. Although he had experienced so many things since he left Kovardo, he had not forgotten the memories of his childhood. Grafine nodded, as if the mention of this name made her look a little complicated. "He gave me a suggestion in the letter."